Chapter 2434. Luo Fan naturally did not have any intention of explaining to the creature's confusion. Even though his light of heaven and earth had turned into an inescapable net at this moment, it had surrounded the creature along with the layer of Tao that covered its body. The situation had developed to the point where even if the creature reacted, it would not be able to fight back. Suddenly, the creature's mind cleared up, and it suddenly had a flash of inspiration. It understood just how foolish it had been for all these years, and the confusion on its face suddenly turned into deep regret. "What have I done?" he muttered. His figure shrank, and the tentacles that had been inserted into the great Tao and were controlling the great Tao to fight against Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth were completely withdrawn. As it made this choice, the bit of Tao that had been suppressed to the point of being unable to resist at all seemed to have suddenly recovered its vitality, and it suddenly underwent countless mysterious changes. It actually managed to withstand the light of heaven and earth's inescapable net, and it faintly felt like it was about to become independent and completely separate from the light of heaven and earth in the outside world. Looks like it really has understood its mistake. Seeing this, Luo Fan's expression changed slightly, and he suddenly smiled faintly. The changes in the bit of Tao that remained in front of him had clearly broken free from the creature's will, and the various reactions of the Tao itself once again dominated the various responses it should make against its enemies. When the creature saw the power that erupted from the Tao after it completely let go, it could not help but feel even more regretful. This was because at this moment, the power that the Tao released was at least 10,000 times stronger than when it was under its control. Even the strange light outside, which had made him run for his life in the past millions of years and had cut the originally vast great Tao into this tiny bit of light, couldn't suppress it for a while. This situation clearly showed that its guess just now was correct. When it controlled the Tao to fight against the strange light, it did not increase the power of the Tao at all. On the contrary, it dragged down the Tao and became its weakness. If it had realized this earlier, the situation would definitely not have developed to this state. Unfortunately, it's too late. The creature sighed bitterly as it looked at Luo Fan with an unwilling gaze. Luo Fan smiled faintly despite being stared at like this. At the end of the day, it's because you look down on this world and don't have a clear understanding of your own position. If I was able to recognize this, I would have thrown myself into the cycle of reincarnation in this world, and I would definitely not have made such a mistake. After all these years of fighting, Luo Fan had gradually understood the nature of this creature through Tonggue's deduction of its behavior. In reality, this creature must have an extremely close relationship with the true saint who created this world. This close connection caused this creature to be infected with the mentality of a true sage. As a result, when he looked at the world around him, he naturally had a feeling of looking down on everything. This sort of overlooking caused him to not even trust the grand Taos of the world, much less the will of the world itself. That was why he was able to divide the will of the world, as well as interfere with the great Tao. It was actually not difficult to reverse this sort of overlooking. All it needed was for this creature to personally witness the power of this world and its mysteries. If he wanted to do this even more easily, he only needed to throw himself into the cycle of reincarnation and reincarnate as a creature of this world. Then, he would naturally be able to experience his own insignificance, as well as the vastness and power of the world. However, it was clear that the creature did not manage to do this. All this while he had been observing the world from a transcendent point of view, controlling the development of the world, and even dividing the will of the world itself. After doing all these things, the feeling of looking down on the world naturally did not disappear. Instead, it grew stronger with the passage of time. In the end, it led to the current outcome. It made the creature make a mistake that could have been avoided with just a slight twist of its head. It could even be considered a low-level mistake. Indeed, in the end, I still can't recognize myself. The creature sighed. Now, can you tell me who you are? Luo Fan looked at the creature and asked plainly. The creature only smiled. Do you think I'll tell you? You're currently devouring my world and destroying my existence. No, I'm only going through my own tribulation, Luo Fan said calmly. His gaze was distant, as if it contained endless secrets and principles. The creature shuddered. It looked at Luo Fan with a bewildered gaze. What do you mean? It had countless doubts in its heart and couldn't help but ask. I don't believe that you don't feel anything at all. Luo Fan only smiled faintly. The creature fell silent. Although Luo Fan didn't explain what he was referring to, the creature already knew what he was referring to. Moreover, after knowing this, it also understood that the strange feeling it had ever since the world was created wasn't an illusion. Is this world really just a clone? I'm also just a duplicate? It sighed. Although it was a question, its tone was full of certainty. Luo Fan only smiled. He didn't admit it, nor did he deny it. However, his attitude clearly represented many things. The creature bitterly smiled, and a look of realization appeared on its face. It was as if it had achieved great enlightenment, so that's how it is. No wonder the memories of the past don't feel real. I'm just a wisp of a true divine's aura, but my essence is so much worse than a true divine's. So it's all because I'm just a forced clone. The creature sighed. Its body gradually emitted an indescribable brilliance. This brilliance was so strange and mysterious. Even the surrounding great Tao seemed to be affected by this light. Under this light, it began to distort in a strange way. As this distortion occurred, the great Tao seemed to become more real, as if it had lost some kind of external illusion. Under this change, the great Tao's ability to resist the light of heaven and earth outside began to weaken rapidly. The light of heaven and earth began to suppress the great Tao again. It completely suppressed the great Tao. It looked like it was about to completely devour the great Tao and make it a part of the light of heaven and earth. However, the creature didn't care about this at all. It merely raised its many tentacles and looked at the brilliance emitted from them. There seemed to be endless information flashing through its eyes. In the end, at a certain moment, his body trembled slightly, and his octopus-like body completely collapsed, turning into an indescribable aura. Under the wrapping of the great path, it was like an extremely thin cloud of smoke. As expected, it's a wisp of a true divine's aura. Seeing this change, Luo Fan's eyes shone brightly. Immediately after, the light disappeared, and he sighed. It's a pity that it's just a copy of this great disaster. It's completely different. It doesn't have much of the profoundness of a true divine's aura. At this moment, his light of heaven and earth had already completely shattered the remaining great path and devoured it into the light of heaven and earth. It was no longer the great Tao that directly came into contact with that wisp of aura, but Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth. At this moment, the entire world and the outside world had become extremely chaotic. It was as if the entire world had been completely shattered into countless fragments and then reassembled at random. At a glance, it seemed as if countless fragments were gathering around the light of the world like smoke, revolving around the light of the world and undergoing various transformations. At a glance, it seemed as if the entire world was left with only Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth and the wisp of aura that was enveloped by the light of heaven and earth, an illusory life, an illusory life. It's a pity that it's only now that it's a little bit real. A disappointed voice came from the aura. As the voice spoke, the wisp of aura gradually dissipated and disappeared without a trace in the blink of an eye. The entire process was so fast that even Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth could not catch a single trace of it and could not leave a single trace of the aura, as expected of a true divine's aura, even if it's just a copy. Luo Fan could not help but sigh when he saw the change in the wisp of aura. His light of heaven and earth had already enveloped the aura like an inescapable net. Under such circumstances, the aura could actually still self-destruct through some kind of change that he could not understand. This had already exceeded his original estimation of the aura, and he could not help but sigh. The dissipation of the wisp of aura also meant that the last bit of resistance in this world had disappeared without a trace. This meant that this world had become a piece of cake waiting for him to devour. After confirming that the aura had really disappeared without a trace, Luo Fan did not hesitate any longer. He immediately directed his thoughts towards the light of heaven and earth that had changed its appearance and seemed to have a strange pillar supporting it. As this thought entered his mind, the light of heaven and earth turned and suddenly produced an endless suction force. It began to continuously pull the fragments of the world that had been shattered and reassembled in the outside world towards the light of heaven and earth. They continuously entered the light of heaven and earth and gradually fused with the light of heaven and earth, turning into a part of the light of heaven and earth. With this change, the pillar inside the light of heaven and earth also began to distort and gradually change into the appearance of roots. A situation similar to the previous world appeared at the border of this world. The endless great calamity, evil chi, continued to press down on this world as it was devoured, filling up the space that the world had made way for, creating a phenomenon like the sudden appearance of a storm. Luo Fan had already expected this change. At this moment, his expression did not change at all. He only continued to control the light of heaven and earth to devour the fragments of the world outside. Even the world had been minced and devoured, so the existence of time naturally became meaningless. After an unknown period of time, which seemed to be 1,000,000,000 years or just a few breaths, this world was completely submerged in the light of heaven and earth. Along with this world, there is also a boundless great calamity, evil chi, that seemed to be able to completely crush any existence. Compared to before, Luo Fan, who had already expected this, had already strengthened the protection of the light of heaven and earth to a certain extent. In the face of the violent impact of the great calamity, evil chi, he only felt his body tremble violently, but his body did not suffer much damage, of course. Even so, he was stunned for a long time before he regained consciousness. His expression remained blank for a long time. The terrifying impact of the great calamity, evil chi, in the outside world was due to the instantaneous change caused by the sudden disappearance of the world. After a while, when the great calamity, evil chi, completely filled the gap caused by the disappearance of the world, the pressure naturally eased, and the pressure on the light of heaven and earth naturally weakened to the extent that the light of heaven and earth could withstand. At this moment, Luo Fan regained consciousness. He turned his head and saw the fragment that had devoured the world in the boundless great calamity, evil chi, as well as the light of heaven and earth that the fragment carried. Compared to when his consciousness had just fused with the octopus world, there didn't seem to be any changes to the fragment and the light between the heavens and earth. It was still as calm and indifferent as before. It floated in the boundless, ominous aura, giving off a feeling that it was impervious to all tribulations. At this moment, the fragment opened its eyes, and a familiar gaze appeared in them. Immediately afterward, the two fragments shouted at the same time, "Merge!" Along with this shout, the two light of heaven and earth instantly merged and turned into one. The two Luo Fan also overlapped with each other and directly merged into one Luo Fan. Under this fusion, Luo Fan's cultivation realm improved once again. In a trance, he seemed to be one step closer to becoming a sixth tribulation powerhouse. In other words, he was one step closer to breaking through the shackles of the realm before him. The change in the light of heaven and earth was even more obvious. The roots of the two huge roots directly merged into one, making the light of heaven and earth look like two roots had grown from a source. Seeing this, a faint smile appeared on Luo Fan's face. Although there were some twists and turns, it was still smooth in the end, he murmured. His gaze swept across the world, and the unknown number of trillions of worlds in the great calamity, evil chi, entered his eyes. At this moment, because he had merged with the two fragments, his essence had become much stronger. However, his will was still his entire will, and there was no difference compared to before. There were no melodramatic incidents like the main body and the main body clashing with each other. Chapter 2435. The boundless ominous aura clearly simulated the state of chaos. In such a place, time clearly did not exist. Of course, for Luo Fan, who possessed the will of a living being, time seemed to exist. As a result, what determined a living being's time was clearly their perception of time. As a result, for Luo Fan, how much time he spent in the great calamity's baleful aura completely depended on his own will and his own thoughts. Because there were simply too many worlds that he had to deal with. There were even trillions of them. As a result, when he dealt with those worlds, or rather, when he helped the fragments that existed in those worlds to transcend, he slowed down his own time to an extreme degree. As a result, every instant he experienced in the world where his will descended would be counted in billions of years. As a result, the heaven and earth light within the great calamity baleful aura would replace the heaven and earth light and fuse with it at every instant. At the same time, there would be a fragment that looked exactly like him fusing into his body at every moment. This change caused his cultivation realm to continuously climb. As he advanced towards the level of a sixth tribulation expert, the light of the world was also growing indescribably at every moment. The greatest manifestation of this growth was that the light of the world was becoming more and more resplendent, and the number of roots inside was also increasing. Just like this, over 1,000,000 years had passed in Luo Fan's senses. The countless worlds that were originally densely packed in the Great Tribulation baleful aura had unknowingly been reduced to only a few hundred worlds. These hundreds of worlds were scattered in the boundless great calamity baleful chi. They were like scattered stars scattered in the pitch-black starry sky. They seemed so distant and mysterious. The light of heaven and earth around Luo Fan's body had completely changed at this moment. It seemed like a real world, and it revolved around Luo Fan. There seemed to be endless light and shadows, countless mysteries, and countless phenomena that could only appear in a real world. Amidst this realistic light of heaven and earth, there were trillions of densely packed roots. Like an incomparably complex network, they covered every corner of the light of heaven and earth and connected every inch of it. At the point where these roots were connected, which was also the origin, they had already merged into an existence that was billions of times more complicated than before. The billions of roots that were originally distinct had unknowingly mixed up the barriers between each other and truly merged into a huge main root. The formation of this main root also truly unified the countless trillions of heaven and earth, great Tao, and world that had previously fused with the light of heaven and earth, causing them to truly become a part of the light of heaven and earth. They truly became the support for the light of heaven and earth, the resources for its growth. On this day, when Luo Fan fused a certain fragment back into his body and also fused a certain fragment of the light of the world into the light of the world suddenly began to tremble violently. In this trembling, the will of the world within the light of the world began to produce an indescribable sublimation. The light of heaven and earth that was originally like a living thing gradually retracted that feeling of a living thing. A sense of vastness, and boundlessness slowly seeped out from the light of heaven and earth. The infinite existence that had originally seemed extremely chaotic within the light of the world seemed to have been combed by some great power. In the blink of an eye, it had already been reconstructed, turning into countless space-times and worlds, forming a complete system of worlds. Within this system, there was an extremely fundamental existence that connected all space-times, all heavens, and all worlds within the entire group of worlds. It was a worldview that completely belonged to Luo Fan. The trillions of roots that had originally existed within the light of the world became increasingly blurry. In the end, they completely disappeared without a trace in an instant, as if they had never been there in the first place. Metamorphosed? At this moment, a strange thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. With this thought, he felt that his understanding of the world, his understanding of cultivation, and his worldview had all made unimaginable leaps forward. In a trance, he seemed to have broken through some indescribable barrier and became completely different from before. If he were to face his previous self now, he was confident that he could easily crush his previous self to death with a single finger. Even if he had a close connection with the corresponding existences in the countless planes just a moment ago, and as long as he did not completely wipe out the existences in all the planes, he would not die, but he could not stop the current him from completely crushing a finger of his previous self. Moreover, it was a crushing that had no possibility of resurrection. I've finally broken through. Sensing his changes, how could Luo Fan not understand that he had already crossed the barrier between the fifth and sixth tribulations? He had truly become a sixth tribulation powerhouse, carefully experiencing the process of his breakthrough, comprehending the various subtle changes that had taken place in his body during this process. Luo Fan seemed to have understood something in his heart, as if he had comprehended more things that could only be understood but could not be explained in words. This was the first time that he had such a clear understanding of the breakthrough he had obtained during the Great Tribulation. In the past, when he had undergone the Great Tribulations, he had relied on himself to endure the attacks of the Great Tribulations. In the end, he discovered that he had broken through after the Great Tribulation, and his strength was completely different from before. As for where exactly he had broken through and how exactly he had broken through, he was still unclear. Although it was not to the extent of being completely confused, it was difficult for him to easily describe it. Only this time, during the sixth Great Tribulation, did he truly grasp the entire process of breaking through. He grasped the entire process of his cultivation, rising bit by bit from the peak of the fifth tribulation to finally crossing the bottleneck and the sturdy barrier before him. Any first time was of great significance to a living being. Even Luo Fan was the same. This was the first time he had felt his cultivation breakthrough during the Great Tribulation of the world. To him, this feeling was extremely wonderful. It allowed him to vaguely understand the nature of the Great Tribulation a little more. Perhaps the Great Tribulation is a guide, a fortuitous encounter, not a punishment. Thinking of this, his expression became inexplicably deep. After breaking through, the surrounding Great Tribulation baleful chi was no longer as absolute to him as before. At this moment, he felt that his senses were no longer obstructed by the boundless Great Tribulation baleful chi around him. In the blink of an eye, he had already traversed the boundless Great Tribulation baleful chi. He instantly understood every inch of the Great Tribulation baleful chi, as well as the various mysterious and subtle structures within the Great Tribulation baleful chi. With a thought, he made a grabbing motion with his hand, and a mysterious power spread out from his hand. It was directly used on the few hundred remaining worlds that were scattered in the Great Calamity baleful chi at that moment. Next, he exerted some force. The hundreds of worlds were like hundreds of specks of light in the void. They were grabbed by this power and quickly gathered in front of him. In the blink of an eye, they had already gathered into a disk in front of him, densely piling up there. Next, he smiled faintly and waved his hand. The hundreds of worlds shook and completely collapsed. They were completely devoured by the light of the universe that originally existed within them, turning into hundreds of specks of light that quickly gathered towards the light of the universe around Luo Fan. They directly fused with the light of the universe, adding hundreds of strange worlds to the cluster of worlds within the light of the universe. The incomparably huge and complicated roots flashed by, as if hundreds of roots had been added, before disappearing once again. At the same time, hundreds of fragments appeared from the remnants of the worlds and quickly rushed towards Luo Fan. They completely fused with Luo Fan's body in the blink of an eye. It added an indescribable sense of perfection to his already unparalleled strength. It was as if he had completely made up for the tiny flaws that he originally had. The entire process clearly showed that the worlds that were originally rather troublesome for him were no longer a problem. They could no longer restrain his fragments or his light of the universe. However, at this moment, Luo Fan's attention was not on the worlds that were no longer obstructing him. Instead, it was on the boundless great tribulation, baleful chi around him. "Break for me," he cried out as he looked at the boundless great tribulation, baleful chi around him. With this shout, the light around his body slightly trembled and suddenly shot out countless strands of light. Like strange arms, these strands of light grabbed the boundless great tribulation, evil chi around him and tore it in all directions. With this tear, the boundless great tribulation, baleful chi began to surge violently. Endless power quickly rushed towards Luo Fan from all directions and fiercely pressed against the light of the heavens and earth. It wanted to crush the light of the heavens and earth. At the very least, it wanted to push back the countless palms that the light of the heavens and earth had created. However, in the eyes of Luo Fan, who could now see the structure of the Great Tribulation baleful chi with a single glance, there were too many flaws in this pressure. He did not even need to guide the light of the universe to take any action. Just the light of the universe responding on its own was enough to easily crush the terrifying pressure produced by the boundless Great Tribulation baleful chi. The light of the universe was not affected at all as it continued to tear apart the Great Tribulation baleful chi. The foundation of the Sixth Tribulation began to tremble violently, showing signs of collapsing at any moment. In the face of this situation, Luo Fan's expression did not change as he let out a roar. With this roar, the boundless heaven and earth within the light of the universe, the world, and the space-time all exerted force at the same time. Under the guidance of the hidden will of the universe, an endless and terrifying power poured into the arms formed by the light of the universe and tore them apart in all directions. This caused the Great Tribulation baleful chi in front of Luo Fan to gradually reveal a strange nothingness, a nothingness that led to the outside of the Great Tribulation baleful chi. At this moment, the Great Tribulation baleful chi continued to surge. Figures appeared out of nowhere in the depths of the Great Tribulation baleful chi and looked at Luo Fan from afar. Luo Fan was extremely familiar with these figures. Shockingly, they were the existences related to true saints that he had seen when he had transcended or devoured the countless trillions of heavens and earths. They were either auras, shadows, living beings that resonated with true sages, gazes left behind by true sages, or items of true sages. Compared to the heavens and earth, the existences in the Great Calamity baleful chi were much stronger. The boundless Great Tribulation baleful chi continued to flow into the bodies of these existences, constantly increasing their power and causing their auras to swell at every moment. When they first appeared, these existences were just as strong as they had been in the world. However, in just a short while, these existences had far surpassed their state in the world. They were not just 1 or 2 times stronger than they had been in the world, but thousands or even tens of thousands of times stronger. How could Luo Fan not feel anything when he was stared at by these gazes? At this moment, his gaze shifted from the Great Tribulation baleful chi that had been torn apart around him to the countless existences in the depths of the Great Tribulation baleful chi. Looking at these figures, Luo Fan had a look of realization on his face. As expected, it's impossible for me to get through this Great Tribulation baleful chi so easily. This thought flashed across his mind, and he stopped tearing apart the Great Tribulation baleful chi. This kind of tearing might cause damage to the Great Tribulation baleful chi, but at the same time, if he wanted to continue tearing it apart, he would need to spend more effort and more strength. This kind of consumption was naturally not a big deal under normal circumstances. However, with so many existences related to true sages eyeing him covetously, this kind of consumption could lead to eternal damnation if he was not careful. At the same time, in many other worlds, the existences corresponding to Luo Fan were also surrounded by various dangerous existences. Those were obviously the existences corresponding to the existences related to true sages in many other worlds. Because these existences had become more powerful, their encirclement of the existences corresponding to Luo Fan was at least 10 times tighter than what Luo Fan had imagined. The pressure that was emitted during the encirclement was also much stronger than what he had imagined. From this point, it could be seen that it was already impossible for him to easily avoid the encirclement and escape from the different worlds. Chapter 2436. The aura released by the countless existences related to true sages continued to rise and sublimate, causing Luo Fan, who was extremely far away from them, to feel an increasingly terrifying pressure. In the face of the pressure released by the countless existences, Luo Fan's heart trembled slightly. The light of heaven and earth shook slightly and carried his body towards those existences at high speed. He was not interested in waiting to be besieged by these existences. The boundless great calamity, evil chi, no longer had the same absolute characteristics as before to the current light of heaven and earth. At this moment, although the great calamity evil chi could still obstruct the light of heaven and earth, it only required the light of heaven and earth to expend some energy to break through the obstruction. In such a process, in just a flash, the light of heaven and earth had already left behind a vacuum mark in the boundless great calamity ominous aura that almost completely separated the great calamity ominous aura. It directly went from its original position to the depths of the great calamity ominous aura, where many existences related to true sages were. In the face of Luo Fan and the light of heaven and earth, none of the existences related to true sages were interested in talking to Luo Fan. Almost all of them attacked him at the same time. Waves of aura that belonged to true sages were released from their bodies. Mysterious and wonderful attacks that had the effect of destroying heaven and earth pounced towards Luo Fan from all directions. Although the great calamity evil chi was still great calamity evil chi in essence, it simulated the state of chaos in this great calamity evil chi. Such a great calamity evil chi naturally had some characteristics of a state of chaos. At this moment, under the countless attacks that contained the aura of true sages, the great calamity evil chi was driven by the attacks and produced billions of changes that could not be described with words. Countless light shadows were formed, and they directly drowned Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth. At this moment, the light of heaven and earth, which was like a group of worlds around Luo Fan's body, wriggled slightly, and there seemed to be countless roots appearing within it. Then, all kinds of strange waves were transmitted from the light of heaven and earth and quickly surged in all directions. Along with this change, the surrounding great tribulation baleful aura, which had undergone all sorts of changes due to the attacks that contained the aura of a true saint, seemed to have been instantly suppressed. The changes that were originally happening almost instantly calmed down. It was as if the space-time dimension behind the great calamity evil chi had suddenly been pressed to pause. Originally, the coordination between the many existences related to true sages was extremely tacit and could even be said to be perfect. But at this moment, when the numerous attacks were stopped, the almost perfect coordination could no longer be called perfect. Countless small openings appeared out of nowhere among the numerous attacks, and could be said, after all, the perfect combination itself was a combination of time and space dimensions. Now, the light of the space-time and the space-time dimension were extremely dense. The attacks were, and the evil divine sages. To it, the seas and the sages of sages, and evil divine Ordo evil, the great. In the blink of an eye, the attacks were wrapped up by countless roots. Soon after, all of the attacks trembled slightly before completely collapsing. All of the light and shadows brought about by the attacks also disintegrated during this process and disappeared without a trace. In just a few breaths' time, the many attacks that were related to true sages had completely collapsed against Luo Fan. In the boundless great calamity evil chi, only Luo Fan, the light of heaven and earth on the surface of his body, and the countless existences related to true sages were left. Since these existences related to true sages could be related to true sages, they were definitely not simple. Even though the current situation was extremely bad for them, and it seemed like they no longer had a chance to turn things around, they still couldn't do anything about it. However, not a single one of them was discouraged by this, and not a single one of them was willing to retreat because of this. At this moment, the creatures formed by the remnant aura of true sages were the first to take action. They each launched an attack against the light of heaven and earth. However, compared to the previous attacks, their attacks this time were more targeted. They were targeted at the light of heaven and earth. Although on a fundamental level, these attacks weren't much stronger than the previous ones, they were still much more powerful. However, because of this targeted existence, the threat of these attacks to the light of heaven and earth was many times stronger than before. For a moment, Luo Fan, who was inside the light of heaven and earth, felt an inexplicable pressure coming from all directions from the many new attacks that had just been born. Faintly, the entire Great Calamity Evil Chi seemed to have some kind of movement with the attacks at this moment. It was as if some kind of supreme power had gathered the entire Great Calamity Evil Chi. Then, the Great Calamity Evil Chi began to produce incomparably wonderful turbulence, producing various kinds of indescribable power. The attacks that were launched from all directions seemed to have increased the power of those attacks by 1,000 times. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan did not take any action. He would not make the same mistake that the remnant aura of true sages in the octopus world had made previously. Although he had made a breakthrough, the essence of his life had not reached the true sage's stage. As long as he had not reached the true sage's stage, it was impossible for him to have a willpower that could override the will of heaven and earth. Without this willpower, if he tried to control the will of heaven and earth, the strength that the will of heaven and earth could exert would be greatly hindered. This kind of hindrance was naturally not a big deal to other ordinary living beings, and it would still be enough to easily defeat those living beings. However, if he were to face an enemy that was at the same level as the will of heaven and earth, this kind of hindrance would be a fatal flaw. And now, although the enemies that Luo Fan was facing were not real true sages or supreme existences that were at the same level as the will of heaven and earth, they were still existences that were related to true sages. With the help of the Great Calamity Evil Chi, even if they could not be omnipotent, omniscient, and omniscient like true sages. However, who knew if they would obtain some kind of breakthrough at some point and burst out with a true sage-level attack? With such a worry, how could he not choose a more appropriate method to deal with the attacks of the many existences that were related to true sages? At this moment, other than the auras that were more closely related to true sages, many other existences that were related to true sages also reacted. One by one, they began to join the auras and began to gather their power to help the auras attack the light of heaven and earth, as well as attack Luo Fan, who was inside the light of heaven and earth. Facing such a situation, the light of heaven and earth automatically produced all kinds of extremely exquisite countermeasures. The many roots in the light of heaven and earth seemed to have suddenly turned into divine dragons, rushing out of the light of heaven and earth in an extremely mysterious manner. They stirred in the boundless Great Calamity Evil Chi, and every root brought with it billions of changes in an instant, directly cutting into the numerous attacks in an extremely exquisite manner. The attacks were also extremely extraordinary, and almost every attack was enough to send any perfect world back to the primordial world. The changes contained in every attack were also unimaginably rich. If any of the attacks were to be drawn out and placed in any world, it would probably be enough to cause countless cultivators to have an epiphany, and it was enough to allow countless living beings to comprehend some kind of cultivation truth. However, at this moment, the complexity of the attacks and the changes were completely crushed by the many roots that were released by the light of heaven and earth. The roots that were released by the light of heaven and earth were even more complex and change faster, and the countless earth-shattering attacks were completely wiped out. The entire process was so straightforward that it was as if the attacks were not related to a true saint, but just ordinary castles that were piled up on the beach. Afterward, before Luo Fan could react, the roots had already taken a step further, directly penetrating countless obstacles and directly piercing into the bodies of the many existences that were related to true saints. As the various subtle and inexplicable changes occurred, the countless existences that were related to true saints completely disintegrated, causing them to completely turn invisible in the blink of an eye. They disappeared without a trace in the boundless great calamity, evil chi in the surroundings. In just a few breaths of time, only Luo Fan and his light of heaven and earth were left in the entire great calamity, evil chi. What other tricks do you have? Looking at this scene, Luo Fan seemed to be deep in thought, and an inexplicable look of anticipation appeared on his face. Although the battle between the many existences that were related to true saints and the light of heaven and earth was extremely short, it had already made him feel countless mysteries that he had not felt before, and he had experienced the various incredible characteristics of the existences that were related to true saints. Under such circumstances, at this moment, he could not help but feel an indescribable anticipation for the various tricks that the great calamity evil chi would evolve into. He hoped that the great calamity evil chi would bring him more surprises and allow him to comprehend more profound mysteries of cultivation. Unfortunately, things did not go as he wished. While Luo Fan was waiting for the great calamity evil chi to evolve into more attacks, the great calamity evil chi stopped evolving. The boundless great calamity evil chi seemed to have lost its source, and it began to become thinner and thinner. At this speed, it would not be long before the great calamity evil chi completely disappeared, as if it had never appeared. This situation was almost exactly the same as when he had hoped that the great calamity evil chi would not evolve into too many attacks. Back then, when he had hoped that the great calamity evil chi would not evolve into too many attacks, the great calamity evil chi had also ignored his expectations and directly evolved into countless worlds, directly slicing him into countless pieces. I have already passed the sixth great calamity of the world. At this moment, Luo Fan had an inexplicable understanding. A mixture of regret and joy welled up in his heart. He was naturally happy that he had already passed the great calamity and was one step closer to becoming a true saint. However, it was a pity that he had the protection of the light of heaven and earth. He clearly had enough strength to ignore the danger brought by the great calamity evil chi, and he was looking forward to the great calamity evil chi lasting a little longer and evolving into more complicated changes. However, the great calamity evil chi did not meet his expectations. The dissipation of the great calamity evil chi did not change according to Luo Fan's will. Although it did not dissipate too quickly, it could not be stopped at all. Not long after, all the great calamity evil chi disappeared without a trace, and his surroundings turned into a boundless void. In this void, there seemed to be an indescribable existence rapidly approaching from a mysterious place. Before he could take a clear look at his surroundings and figure out what was approaching him, an endless golden light filled the void after the great calamity evil chi disappeared. The golden light was so mysterious, and there were so many of them. It contained endless sacredness and majesty. Being submerged in this golden light, even Luo Fan had an incomparably comfortable feeling. Subsequently, the golden light began to shrink towards the light of heaven and earth. In just a few breaths, the golden light that had originally covered the endless void had shrunk to a ball of golden light that could only envelop Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth. And because of this shrinking, the brightness of the golden light had unknowingly increased by a few 100 million times. Although it wasn't enough to burn Luo Fan's eyes blind, it still made him lose his sense of the outside world. The only thing left in his senses was the golden light that seemed to be able to burn the eyes of all living beings. An indescribable sense of satisfaction came from the light of heaven and earth, and it affected Luo Fan's mind, making him feel dazed. Whether it was his sense of time or his sense of space, they all lost their meaning in this daze. After an unknown period of time, the golden light completely disappeared, and Luo Fan felt that he had arrived at a completely unfamiliar, brand new place. Before he paid attention to his surroundings, he noticed that his cultivation realm seemed to have taken a step forward, and he was no longer at the level of a sixth tribulation expert. As for his light of heaven and earth, it had completely turned into a disk of light that hung directly behind his head, squirming slowly. Every time it wriggled, the world group inside seemed to undergo some extremely subtle evolution, as if the era in the world group was changing. And every time it wriggled, there were all sorts of unbelievable mysteries contained within, as if it was evolving the infinite principles of the universe, and displaying the various mysteries of cultivation that Luo Fan had and had yet to grasp. Chapter 2437. For Luo Fan, the difficulty of the sixth Great Tribulation was much lower than he had imagined. This was not because the sixth tribulation was easy, but because he had already condensed the light of heaven and earth that he could not condense before the sixth tribulation. It was precisely because of the light of heaven and earth that he was able to maintain the integrity of his will when he was split into billions of pieces. He was still able to perfectly control the countless pieces and prevent them from becoming independent and developing their own consciousness. However, even so, his consciousness had experienced billions of worlds, witnessed the mysteries of billions of worlds, and accepted the endless challenges of billions of worlds. In the end, he finally achieved a breakthrough and successfully passed the tribulation. Even for him, he felt as if he had been in a different world at this moment. After a long time, Luo Fan finally paid attention to his surroundings. According to his last action before the tribulation, he should be on the fifth level of the Tao Master Path. In other words, he should have come here to obtain the light of heaven and earth. At a glance, he was in a strange universe that was completely weaved by light. In this universe, no matter what existence it was completely weaved by the strange light. Whether it was the countless stars in the universe or the empty void of the universe, they were all constructed in this way. With Luo Fan's eyesight, he could clearly see how many legs an ant had, even if it was billions of light years away. At this moment, he swept his eyes across and saw the countless stars in the universe clearly. At first glance, those stars looked like normal stars in the universe. Some were extremely barren and did not meet the requirements of living beings at all. However, some of them were extremely prosperous and full of vitality. Just like the void of the universe, everything that existed on those stars was also woven from light. It seemed so strange and mysterious. Where are those cultivators? Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat. As he thought about it, he began to search for the cultivators who came from outside the Tao Master Path. This was the fifth level of the Tao Master's Path. Naturally, there were also countless cultivators cultivating here. On the other hand, everything on the fifth level was naturally made up of light, so it couldn't be that the foreign cultivators were of the same nature, right? Just like what was mentioned before, Luo Fan's eyesight was amazing. As long as he wanted to find something, it would be impossible for it to escape his senses. Soon, he saw some people who seemed to be foreign cultivators. They were actually using this method to construct their bodies. Is this how they condense the light of heaven and earth? Luo Fan was secretly surprised. With a single thought, the light of heaven and earth behind him trembled slightly, and he instantly traversed several light years, arriving on a planet that was brimming with vitality. They arrived at the place where the creature that seemed to be an outsider cultivator was. At first glance, this creature looked just like any other ordinary creature in this universe. It was also formed from countless rays of light condensed in a strange form. However, as long as one looked carefully, they would find that it was only on the surface. In fact, those things that looked like rays of light hid the flesh, power, mind, and everything else that belonged to this creature in an extremely mysterious way. Newcomer. The creature's reaction was extremely sharp. It immediately discovered Luo Fan the moment he appeared. When it saw the unchanged flesh structure on Luo Fan's body, it could not help but smile. Looking at his reaction, Luo Fan could not help but be slightly stunned. Normally, this should not be the case. When a normal cultivator encountered the existence of another cultivator who suddenly appeared in front of them, they would definitely be vigilant and alert. If they were a little hot-tempered, they might even directly attack. How could they be as calm as this cultivator in front of them? It was as if Luo Fan's appearance was not surprising at all. However, since the cultivator in front of him was so calm, Luo Fan naturally did not bother to check his memory. At this moment, he just smiled and said, "Fellow Taoist, how can you tell? Only a fellow Taoist who has just ascended will walk on this 5th level with this kind of flesh and blood body. Besides, you've brought up a world group from the 4th level. This is really too obvious, isn't it?" The cultivator looked at Luo Fan and could not help but laugh. This place was the top of a mountain that was neither too tall nor too short on this planet. Behind this cultivator was a rather ordinary-looking stone house, and this creature was currently sitting in front of the mountain and fishing in the sea of clouds ahead. Hearing this person's words, Luo Fan knew that this person thought that the light of heaven and earth above his head was the world group that was brought up from the 4th level. However, this was also normal. At this moment, the light of heaven and earth indeed showed the appearance of an extremely strange world group. At least on the surface, there was not much difference between it and the world group that was brought up from the 4th level. Moreover, at this moment, Luo Fan was completely in the form of flesh and blood. For the cultivator who was already used to the 5th level, this was almost directly saying that this was the world group. I see. I didn't expect this to be the thing that revealed my identity. I'm Luo Fan. What's your name, fellow Taoist? Luo Fan said with a smile. Hearing this, the cultivator was slightly taken aback. He turned his head and said, "Fellow Taoist, you don't know me? If you don't know me, why did you directly come to me?" His tone was as absurd as saying that Luo Fan did not know that the sun was round. Luo Fan could not help but be surprised and asked, "Fellow Taoist clearly knows that I've just ascended. Why do you think I know you?" Hearing this, the cultivator could not help but laugh. Then, he withdrew his power that was fishing in the sea of clouds and turned to face Luo Fan. "It seems that I'm the first cultivator that you've encountered since ascending. In that case, fellow Taoist luck is truly very good. The first person you came to was me. If you found someone else, I'm afraid it wouldn't be so pleasant." While speaking, the cultivator introduced himself to Luo Fan. Then, he talked about why he was the first to find him was a lucky thing. It was because this cultivator was called Perfected Zhongde. Although he was the disciple of a Tao master, he was very friendly to itinerant cultivators and was a good teacher. For anyone who came to ask for advice, no matter their identity, even if they were mortals, he would answer almost all of their requests. No matter what they asked, as long as he knew it, he would tell them everything. Because of this, no matter where he lived in seclusion, there would always be a large number of cultivators coming to him to ask for advice on things they didn't know. Some even asked for advice on cultivation. This was the reason why he was so calm when he first saw Luo Fan. It was because he had seen Luo Fan's dangerous way too many times. It could even be said that it would appear once every few days, so how could he not be familiar with it? As for what would have happened if Luo Fan went to find other cultivators, Perfected Zhongde also roughly explained. The most likely development was that the cultivator would directly attack Luo Fan and completely destroy Luo Fan, who had just arrived at the 5th floor and had not yet fully adapted to the rules of the 5th floor. After all, cultivators who lived on the stars had the nature of cultivating in seclusion. If they suddenly appeared in front of him, even if it was not considered as destroying his cultivation, it would definitely be considered as a provocation. How could they not erupt? After all, not everyone was a virtuous immortal. Understanding this, Luo Fan naturally didn't seem to care. Of course, it was not that Perfected Zhongde's calculation was wrong, and things would not develop as he predicted. It was because he didn't think that these cultivators could do anything to him. In other words, if they made a move, the one who would suffer would not be him. Just like at this time, if perfected Jonda didn't choose to have a good talk with Luo Fan and instead chose to make a move, his memory would definitely be completely exposed to Luo Fan now. However, since perfected Jonda was so friendly to him, he naturally couldn't directly say arrogant words like he could suppress all hostility. At the moment, he just apologized and said that he was really lucky to be able to meet perfected Jonda. This star was quite strange. There were countless cloud beasts hidden in the sea of clouds. They lived in the sea of clouds like ordinary fish living in the sea. The reason why perfected Jonda chose this star to live was because he was interested in this kind of cloud beasts. He chose this mountain that didn't seem to have anything special because there were a lot of cloud beasts in this location. Of course, when he fished in this sea of clouds before, he didn't really need this kind of fishing for any research or cultivation, but just to pass the time. Now that Luo Fan was here, he had already put aside the matter of fishing and directly pulled Luo Fan to his stone house. This stone house was a world that he had opened up. It had a round sky and a flat earth, with various terrains and landscapes. Moreover, more importantly, the composition of this world was completely different from the composition of the universe outside. It was not weaved by light, but a real structure like the ordinary world that Luo Fan had seen before. Once he arrived, Reverend Zhong let out a long breath. He shuddered, and the countless threads of light that formed his body shuddered slightly at that instant. The flesh, blood, power, and everything else hidden in the countless threads of light were released to replace his body, allowing him to regain the appearance of a body of flesh and blood. Finally, I can relax. Although maintaining the state of light can help me better understand the essence of light and is good for condensing the light of heaven and earth, after all, it conflicts with the essence. It's really too uncomfortable. Perfected Jonda stretched his body, and a relaxed expression appeared on his face. When Luo Fan came here, he also felt that his body was slightly lighter, as if some kind of shackles had been removed, and his body and mind became inexplicably comfortable. Feeling this change, for a moment, Luo Fan thought of many things, and he had a better understanding of the nature of the countless light threads in the universe outside. Faintly, he had some understanding of why these cultivators had to transform themselves in that way. Perhaps it was not only to use that form to understand the mystery of the light of heaven and earth, and eventually condense the light of heaven and earth. More importantly, it was because if they did not exist in that way, they were afraid that they would be hurt by the fifth level of the road to Tao Master. Of course, this was only for ordinary cultivators. For Luo Fan, who had sublimated the light of heaven and earth to the level of countless roots, that kind of possible harm was obviously nothing to him. Almost all the harm had been absorbed by the light of heaven and earth. It was precisely because of this that he was so slow to react. He only discovered the existence of this injury when he entered this area that was completely isolated from the light of the fifth layer. How is it? Do you feel it? Do you feel that the consumption of the origin has disappeared? At this time, Perfected Jonda said to Luo Fan with a smile at this time. Hearing this, Luo Fan already understood the impact of the light of the fifth level on cultivators. Now that he understood what this effect was, he also understood what that light was. It has indeed disappeared. Thank you, Taoist friend, Luo Fan said with a smile. Perfected Jonda laughed and did not take Luo Fan's thanks seriously at all. He just took Luo Fan to the place in this world where he lived and told Luo Fan many of the taboos that he knew to cultivate in the fifth level. He also gave Luo Fan the star map of the fifth level, marking a large number of suitable places for cultivators to cultivate. This kind of attitude was almost like he regarded Luo Fan as a good friend who had gone through life and death. Even ordinary people might not be as meticulous to their good friends who had gone through life and death. His attitude made Luo Fan suddenly understand why Taoist Master Jonda did not need to guard against him at all, and was unexpectedly so magnanimous towards his appearance. If he faced anyone else with this kind of attitude, then obviously he would not have any enemies. And without enemies, he naturally did not need to be vigilant against anyone and could face anyone openly. Not to mention others, didn't Luo Fan, who originally planned to directly search his memory, because of his attitude, didn't he give up his original plan and change to using words to communicate with him? This kind of communication took a few days. In these days, Luo Fan also felt how wide the circle of friends of perfected Zhongda was. In just a few days, there were nearly 20 cultivators who came to find him. They asked him something, told him something, demanded something, or sent something. It really made Luo Fan feel that it was an eye-opener. Chapter 2438. A few days later, Taoist Master Zhongda finally told Luo Fan everything that a cultivator who had just stepped into the 5th level needed to know. This allowed Luo Fan to finally have a complete concept of the entire 5th level of the Tao Master's path. Thank you, Taoist friend. Before leaving, Luo Fan said to Taoist Master Zhongda, "It's just a small effort. I only hope it can help Taoist friend." Taoist Master Zhongda said with a smile. From his expression, he didn't feel that he had done anything for Luo Fan. As for whether the actions of other cultivators were sincere or not, Luo Fan could naturally see at a glance. He had clearly seen Taoist Master Zhongda's performance over the past few days. Every word and every action was from the bottom of his heart. What he did was what he thought in his heart. In other words, his kindness towards other cultivators wasn't some kind of hypocrisy or some kind of scheme. Instead, his heart was truly filled with kindness. If it was hypocrisy or some kind of scheme, Luo Fan naturally wouldn't be moved. However, all the kindness of the other party came from the bottom of his heart and came from his own heart. Luo Fan couldn't help but be moved. At this moment, he smiled slightly and said, "Taoist friend's little effort will be of great benefit to me. How about this? Since Taoist friend has helped me so much, I can't not return the favor." As he spoke, he pointed at Taoist Master Zhongda's forehead. This finger wasn't fast and seemed to be moving slowly. However, Taoist Master Zhongda found that no matter how he dodged, he couldn't escape this finger. Of course, with Taoist Master Zhongda's temperament, he didn't think that Luo Fan would harm him. At this time, he didn't have too strong of a desire to avoid it. He just said, "Taoist friend is really too polite." Before he finished speaking, Luo Fan's finger had already touched his forehead. In an instant, a little light was transmitted from the finger into Taoist Master Zhongda's body. In an instant, Taoist Master Zhongda was stunned. His body froze, and his eyes were empty and vacant. There seemed to be countless turbulent waves of information surging in the depths of his eyes. Seeing this, Luo Fan smiled slightly and no longer paid attention to him. He lifted his foot and took a step forward. His figure flashed and disappeared from the cave mansion, leaving the planet where Taoist Master Zhongda lived. Half a day after Luo Fan left, Taoist Zhongda gradually came back to his senses. His expression became shocked, as if he had suddenly discovered that an ant was actually a supreme god that could destroy the heavens and earth. There was disbelief in the depths of his eyes. How is this possible? How could he possibly know the bottleneck of my light of heaven and earth? He murmured, wondering if he was dreaming. Before Luo Fan left, the information that was poured into Taoist Master Zhongda's mind was none other than how to break through a certain bottleneck that Taoist Master Zhongda had encountered in his cultivation. It was about the bottleneck of the construction of the light of heaven and earth. Although he had only skimmed through the contents of the book for the past half a day, he had gained a lot just by skimming through it. He felt that this method was extremely feasible. If he followed this method to cultivate, it was very likely that he would break through this bottleneck and make great progress in the construction of the light of heaven and earth. Luo Fan. Luo Fan. I seem to have heard of this name. Suddenly, Taoist Master Zhongda thought of something and a strange expression appeared on his face. After all, he was already an expert who could stand on the 5th level of the Tao Master's road. Moreover, he was a disciple of a Tao Master. Needless to say, his memory was strong. As he thought back, he quickly found the source of this familiarity. His expression suddenly became even more strange. It seems that some of my fellow disciples were looking for an ascender who ascended from the 4th level. It seems that they wanted to find trouble with him. Could it be that fellow Taoist Luo Fan is the cultivator that they were looking for? Taoist Master Zhongde murmured and was at a loss for a moment. Then he shook his head and sighed. Forget it. These things have nothing to do with me. I'd better cultivate honestly. After saying this, his expression became calm again. At this time, a breath came from outside, but it was a breath that Taoist Master Zhongde was quite familiar with. It was one of the fellow disciples that he had just thought of. Feeling this breath, Taoist Master Zhongde frowned slightly and showed a rare look of displeasure. However, his temperament was still there. After letting out a sigh, his figure flickered and turned back into the form of the countless lines of light. He exited his cave dwelling and came to the front of the stone house. At this time, a figure descended from the sky and directly stood in the air, not far away from him. This was a figure that was also made of countless lines of light. He looked like a middle-aged man, but the aura that lingered around him was completely different from Taoist Master Zhongde's calm aura. Instead, it was a kind of high and mighty pride, a kind of majesty that controlled everything. It was as if everything in the world was under his control. The middle-aged man looked at Taoist Master Zhongde and frowned. Senior brother Zhongde, what do you think about that matter? It has already been decades. Don't tell me that you wish to continue dragging this out? The middle-aged man looked at Reverend Zhongde, frowned and said. Taoist Master Zhongde sighed and said, Junior brother Lu Yu, I have already said it very clearly. You can handle this matter by yourselves. I prefer to honestly train by myself. Reverend Zhongde sighed and said. Taoist Master Zhongde sighed and said, Cultivate honestly? How many years have you been in the 5th level? You still haven't formed the world's light and can't even stabilize its embryonic form. If you continue to cultivate like this, how many trillion years do you want to spend cultivating? Junior brother Lu Yu is very unhappy. This is my Tao. Junior brother doesn't need to say any more. Taoist Master Zhongde said with a firm expression. Hearing this, junior brother Lu Yu was even more unhappy. However, although he looked extremely arrogant and was very impolite to Taoist Master Zhongde, he clearly did not regard Taoist Master Zhongde as an enemy, nor did he plan to attack him. Seeing that Taoist Master Zhongde was so resolute, he could only snort and say, This is the last chance. If you don't seize it, don't regret it in the future. Taoist Master Zhongde shook his head and said, I've already made up my mind. Junior brother Lu Yu, he doesn't need to say any more. Junior brother Lu Yu is unhappy again. He snorted and said, Then it's up to you. This matter will start in 3 years. If you change your mind before then, you can find me at any time. Even at this step, he still left a way out for Taoist Master Zhongde. From this, it could be seen what kind of image Taoist Master Zhongde had in the hearts of others. After junior brother Lu Yu finished speaking, he waved his hand and his figure soared into the sky. He rushed thousands of feet above the void and disappeared without a trace in a flash. Seeing that junior brother Lu Yu disappeared, Taoist Master Zhongde sighed. Sorry, he just helped me, but I can't betray him. As he spoke, there was a look of guilt on his face. It was because he knew the reason why junior brother Lu Yu came and left in a hurry. In fact, junior martial brother Lu Ju had been tasked by 5th senior martial brother to investigate the existence of a cultivator named Luo Fan who might have ascended from the 4th layer during this period of time. Before this, he would never have realized this. After all, he didn't care about this kind of thing, nor did he want to participate in this kind of thing at all. Although he had heard the name Luo Fan many times, every time it went in one ear and out the other, he didn't remember it at all. However, just now when he received the benefits from Luo Fan, he felt that Luo Fan's name was familiar. Therefore, he dug out the contents of Luo Fan's name from the depths of his memory, making this name that originally didn't have much sense become extremely profound at this time. That was why he was able to clearly understand junior brother Lu Yu's task and the trouble it would bring him. With his temperament, concealing the existence of Luo Fan and not helping junior brother Lu Yu to complete his mission was obviously not a small amount of pressure. However, Taoist Master Zhongde was not pedantic after all. Revealing Luo Fan might bring great trouble to Luo Fan, but not saying it would only make junior brother Liu Yu unable to make a contribution. How to choose was not a problem at all. Therefore, at this time, he didn't want to summon junior brother Liu Yu back to tell him what he had hidden. At this time, he just sighed with emotion, turned around and returned to his cave residence, and began to break through the bottleneck according to the method taught by Luo Fan just now. When entering the state of cultivation, he directly hung the sign of closed-door cultivation breakthrough in front of his cave residence, in order to avoid other cultivators who came to find him from disturbing his cultivation because of something. It also prevented them from being anxious because they couldn't find him. It was extremely difficult to condense the light of heaven and earth, whether it was for Luo Fan or for other cultivators on the 5th level, whether they were disciples of Dao Master or row cultivators. In contrast, although the disciples of Dao Master had some advantages in this aspect, it was just some advantages. After all, it was impossible to change the essence, and it was impossible to make the incomparably difficult things so simple. Even if Taoist Master Zhongde wholeheartedly cultivated in the 5th level for so many billions of years, he was still stuck at the step where the embryonic form of the light of heaven and earth was about to take shape. For Taoist Master Zhongde, so many years of accumulation was obviously more than enough. What he lacked now was just the last bit of opportunity. And what Luo Fan taught him was the way to find this opportunity. After returning to the depths of the cave residence, Taoist Master Zhongde restored his flesh and blood body. In his cultivation place, he sat cross-legged with his eyes closed. Spots of light began to float out from the depths of his body and began to slowly condense above his head, to condense into a ball, and to integrate into a whole before getting the guidance of Luo Fan. He could only rearrange those light spots in a specific way according to his own understanding of the composition of the light of heaven and earth and strive to form a complete whole. However, at this time, after getting the guidance of Luo Fan and understanding the key, he completely changed his original approach. He began to let these light spots converge into a strange vortex and began to slowly rotate around his body. During this process, every single one of those specks of light underwent an inexplicable change. They did not fuse with the other specks of light, but instead split up on their own, turning into faintly discernible strange space-time, or worlds, or even heaven and earth. Each of these light spots was condensed by Taoist Master Zhongde over countless years. They were the essence of the light of heaven and earth. The truth contained in each point was indescribably rich, enough to shock any cultivator after seeing it. It was naturally not difficult for such light spots to evolve into space-time, to evolve into a world, and to evolve into a heaven and earth. It could even be said that this was just following the original trend of these light spots. As long as Taoist Master Zhongde gave these light spots a starting power to evolve, these light spots would automatically evolve according to this trend, and eventually complete the evolution of space-time, world, and heaven and earth, allowing these light spots to transform at an extremely fast speed, and also allowing Taoist Master Zhongde to become more and more relaxed. In the end, he did not even need to guide the specks of light at all. The specks of light would constantly evolve on their own, and along the vortex began to spin in an extremely mysterious manner, gradually turning into an incomparably wondrous cluster of worlds. To a certain extent, it was similar to the group of worlds that he had derived from the creation power on the 4th level. After the group of worlds was formed, Taoist Master Zhongde had a thought, and he began to change the way the vortex operated, causing the countless space-time, worlds, and heaven and earth to collide in the process. As they collided, the space-time, worlds, and heaven and earth either destroyed each other, fused with each other, crossed each other, or flew in different directions without being affected at all, displaying all sorts of unbelievable effects. As the changes progressed, the vortex gradually became chaotic, and the number of space-time, worlds, and heaven and earth within it began to decrease. The entire process was like pushing over a domino. Once it began, there was no way to stop it. One could only watch as the group of worlds headed towards an unpredictable future. During the process of the strange changes in the group of worlds, Taoist Master Zhonda felt that there was endless information and principles constantly gushing out from the bottom of his heart. The information was so complicated that even he could only comprehend a little bit of it. However, just these bits and pieces that he was able to comprehend had already allowed his cultivation to improve greatly. He felt as if he was climbing toward a higher level at every single moment, or perhaps it should be said that he was subliming. His perception of time and space had completely disappeared without him realizing it. Gradually, he forgot where he was and how much time he had spent cultivating in seclusion until now. Perhaps he had already left the Tao Master Path, left the Tao Master Great World, and even left the state of chaos. Or perhaps he had always been in the same place. The time that he had experienced might have been hundreds of millions of years, or perhaps it was just a moment. Chapter 2439. An indescribably wonderful feeling lingered in Zhonda Immortal's heart. It made him feel as if he had been reborn, as if nothing could stop him, and all the mysteries of the universe seemed to be in his heart. He was immersed in this wonderful feeling for a while before he gradually came back to his senses. The moment he came back to his senses, he understood what had happened. He had condensed the embryonic form of the light of heaven and earth. He looked at the countless specks of light around him that had evolved into a cluster of worlds. As expected, the cluster of worlds had condensed into a single mass. Due to the collision and fusion between the heavens and the earth, worlds, and space-time, the entire cluster of worlds appeared to be a single sphere of light that had fused into a single entity. An inexplicable aura, like that of a living creature, emanated from this round and integrated light. This was an aura emitted by the embryonic form of the will of heaven and earth. With this aura and all kinds of feelings in his heart, how could he not understand that this was the embryonic form of the light of heaven and earth? I finally broke through. Zhonda Immortal murmured with an indescribable joy on his face. He had been cultivating on the 5th level of the Tao Master's Path for billions of years. During such a long time, he had been suffering and working hard to condense the light of heaven and earth and break the biggest obstacle to ascending to the 6th level. However, all this time, perhaps because of his lack of comprehension, or perhaps because of the problem with his way of cultivation, he had been unable to succeed after waiting for so long. He did not expect that this time, because of a very ordinary act of kindness, he would break through the bottleneck. Although he did not directly condense the light of heaven and earth, he had already successfully condensed the embryonic form of the light of heaven and earth. From now on, what he needed to do was to constantly perfect this embryonic form and cultivate it. Compared to the bitter suffering in front of the bottleneck before, the current task was still extremely complicated, but at least he could see a crooked path. As long as he had enough patience, enough time, and was willing to spend energy, he would eventually be able to make progress little by little. It could be said that such a small change was enough to free Zhonda Immortal from the state of being buried in the boundless bottom of the sea to a relaxed state of freedom. After experiencing the changes in his body and mind, he did not waste any more time in his cave abode. He directly left the cave abode and came to the side of the sea of clouds where he was fishing. At a glance, this star had already undergone a significant change. At first glance, the boundless sea of clouds didn't seem much different from before, but if one were to look carefully, one would notice that the cloud beasts in the sea of clouds had changed countless times. Even though he could still see many traces of the cloud beasts from the past, there was a huge difference in many of their appearances. Unless a powerful cultivator modified them, it would take at least 1,000,000 years for these cloud beasts to change due to the environment of this star. Jinren Zhonda's heart was slightly moved. With a little deduction, he knew how long he had been in seclusion. From the moment he stepped into the abode until now, 8,000,000 years had already passed. It's been 8,000,000 years. I wonder how many fellow cultivators have come to find me, but never met me. Jinren Zhonda sighed. 8,000,000 years was actually not too long for him, who had cultivated on the 5th floor for countless trillions of years. However, ever since he had made friends, he had never been in seclusion for so long. The longest time he had cultivated was only a little over 100,000 years. 8 million years had passed in a single cultivation session, let alone him. Even the cultivators that he usually interacted with were definitely not used to it. Looking at his surroundings, Zhenrenzhongda's body flowed with light that seemed to be alive. With a sweep of the light, a wave of aura instantly appeared in the air. This was none other than the aura left behind by all the living beings that had come to this place over the past 8 million years. This method of pulling out the aura of the past from the river of time was only an extremely basic use of the worldly light. There were many auras, and they were densely piled up here. There were probably over 100,000 of them. Some of them were strong, while others were weak. The strongest among them had already perfected the worldly light to a certain degree, and even had the qualifications to ascend to the 6th floor. As for the weaker ones, they hadn't even grasped the trick to condensing the worldly light. After a brief analysis, Zhenrenzhongda knew the frequency of these auras. The closer he was to the front, the more concentrated the auras became. The closer he was to the present, the more sparse the auras became. When the last aura arrived, it was already tens of thousands of years ago. In other words, during these tens of thousands of years, not a single aura had arrived. In other words, not a single cultivator who was on good terms with Zhenrenzhongda had come to check on him. Looking at these auras, Zhenrenzhongda couldn't help but smile bitterly. I didn't expect so many fellow cultivators to have come. Looks like I'll have to pay them a visit one by one. As he smiled bitterly, the embryonic form of the worldly light he released swept out again and completely erased the auras. Then, he directly left a message in front of the cave abode, saying that he was going to visit a friend. Afterward, he soared into the sky and directly left the planet, flying towards the place where the fellow cultivator closest to him was. He had already formed the embryonic form of the worldly light and needed to properly use it to understand its mysteries. Staying on that planet was not a suitable choice. Since he had to leave to visit a fellow cultivator, he naturally used this time to properly familiarize himself with his embryonic form of the worldly light. After forming the embryonic form of the worldly light, his strength had already made great progress. The distance of several hundred light years was not a problem for him at all. In just a few short breaths, he directly crossed this distance by flying and arrived in front of another planet. Compared to the planet that he had been living in seclusion on, the planet before him was completely different. The planet that he had been living in seclusion was a very normal planet with life. There were all sorts of creatures born on the surface of the planet, and they even built a rather prosperous civilization. There were even some cultivators there. However, the star in front of him was completely different. This star was a barren planet without any signs of life. The surface of the entire planet was covered in a layer of bizarre flames. Everything on the planet was enveloped by the flames. Under the flames, only soil and rocks could remain. Plants and other living things couldn't leave even the slightest trace on the planet. If it were not for the fact that the interior of the planet was composed of soil and rocks, it might have been more appropriate to call a star. Taoist Zhongda has finally come out of seclusion. At this time, a voice was transmitted to Taoist Zhongda's ears. It was a clear male voice. Hearing this voice, Taoist Zhongda naturally revealed a faint smile. Yes, I finally made a small breakthrough this time, Taoist Zhongda said with a chuckle. His gaze converged on a certain place on the surface of the planet. There was a flame vortex there. At the center of the vortex, there seemed to be a subtle distortion of space and time. It was as if there was an extremely complex structure hidden in the vortex. And that voice came from the center of the vortex. At this time, a figure appeared above the vortex, looking at Taoist Zhongda from afar. It was a middle-aged man, a rather handsome middle-aged man with red hair. His entire body seemed to emit heat, and he was completely weaved by light. This was Taoist Zhongda's good friend, a rogue cultivator named Reverend Flame. After seeing Taoist Zhongda, this Reverend Flame suddenly froze, then couldn't help but laugh. I didn't expect that after not seeing you for only a few million years, Taoist Zhonda has already made a breakthrough. This is truly worthy of celebration. Taoist Zhonda descended with a smile and arrived at the center of the vortex. The flames on the surface of the planet were not ordinary flames, but a mysterious flame that could burn one's soul. If an ordinary cultivator came here, even a glance at these flames would damage their soul. However, for an existence like Taoist Zhonda, who had condensed the embryonic form of the world's light, this kind of flame was not an obstacle at all. Even if he directly opened his soul and let it burn, he would not be affected. At this moment, he completely ignored the effect of the flame and directly came to the vortex. This reverend flame and Taoist Zhonda had been friends for hundreds of millions of years, so there was no need to be too polite at this time. He brought Taoist Zhonda to the new secret realm that he had recently opened up and showed him the various special environments that he had built to cultivate the embryonic form of the world's light. In the last few million years, has there been any special changes in the 5th level? After a tour, Taoist Zhonda asked. Normally, only a few million years was not a long time for the 5th level of the road to Tao Master. He even suspected that the entire 5th level might not have changed in the past few million years. However, the situation was completely different this time, because back then, Luo Fan, who was searched by many Tao Masters, had already entered the 5th level. Moreover, the plan of his fellow disciples had also begun to be implemented at that time. Under the interaction of these two aspects, there must be some special changes in the 5th level in the past few million years. Hearing this, Taoist Zunhua smiled and said, "The changes are not small. The cultivator called Luo Fan, who is searched by many Tao Masters, has appeared. Moreover, he has occupied a forbidden area for himself. Now, he has become an expert of the 5th level. Even though the Tao Masters know of his existence, they do not dare to attack him. Even if they want to enter the forbidden area to cultivate, they need to obtain Luo Fan's permission before they dare to." Taoist Zhonda's expression involuntarily became a little strange. He opened his mouth to speak, but could not say anything. Taoist Zunhua was slightly stunned when he saw Taoist Zhonda's appearance. He and Taoist Zhonda had known each other for hundreds of millions of years and were already extremely familiar with each other. At this moment, when he saw Taoist Zhonda's appearance, he guessed that Luo Fan was probably related to him. After thinking for a moment and combining it with Taoist Zhonda's character, he could not help but be surprised. "Don't tell me that you gave Luo Fan pointers back then?" Taoist Zhonda's expression stiffened. I did communicate with him back then," Taoist Zunhua sighed. "I knew it would be like this. Come to think of it, that forbidden area seems to be the closest forbidden area to the planet where you cultivate. It seems that he immediately rushed to that forbidden area after learning about its existence from you." Taoist Zhonda could not help but smile. "I also did not know that he would make such a choice, but I did not expect him to be so strong. Indeed, a cultivator who has just ascended for millions of years has actually become the master of a forbidden area. Who would believe this?" Taoist Zunhua sighed. His eyes were filled with envy, admiration, and even fear. He had not seen Luo Fan, but from the rumors, he knew how strong he was. It could be said that with his current strength, he could not even withstand a finger from Yi Shiwen. If such an existence had cultivated in the 5th level for hundreds of millions of years, he could still understand it. He also felt that it was reasonable to say that such an existence had returned from the 6th level. However, if it was said that he had ascended from the 4th level, he felt that his views had been subverted. "I think he should have condensed the worldly light to perfection on the 4th level. If he is willing now, perhaps he can already ascend." Taoist Zhonda sighed. His eyes were filled with longing and gratitude. Taoist Zunhua looked at Taoist Zhonda and suddenly had a flash of inspiration. "Don't tell me your breakthrough this time was because of him?" Taoist Zhonda nodded. "It's not a secret that cannot be revealed. It was because he gave me pointers before he left that I was able to grasp the key and break through the bottleneck." "I see. It seems that he is not as unreasonable as the rumors say. Taoist Zunhuo let out a long sigh, as if he had completely let go of a certain knot in his heart. Taoist Zhongde was stunned. Taoist Luo Fan is a very easy person to talk to. Back then, I had a good chat with him. Why did you say that he is unreasonable? You better say this in front of me. If you say such words in front of your fellow disciples, I'm afraid they will immediately fall out with you. Taoist Zhongde said helplessly. Chapter 2440. Taoist Zunhuo sighed and told Zhongde Immortal all the legends about Luo Fan that he had heard in the past 8 million years. As he spoke, Zhongde Immortal felt that his worldview had been subverted. Was a legendary cultivator really the same as the one he had met? Could it be that they had the same name? However, even though he was in disbelief, he did not think that Taoist Zunhuo was lying to him. Therefore, he could only sigh and say, I didn't expect things to develop in such a way. It seems that my understanding of Taoist Luo Fan is still too little. Taoist Zunhuo suddenly smiled and said, Why so serious? Anyway, for us, the distance between us has become extremely far. It is almost impossible for us to have any interaction in the future. As long as we don't provoke him, what does it have to do with us? Zhongde Immortal listened, smiled slightly, nodded, and said no more. Although he was quite kind, he would never take everything on himself. Although he had a conversation with Luo Fan, it was just a conversation. He did not feel that he was responsible for Luo Fan, nor did he think that Luo Fan was responsible for him. In this way, he had only heard about Luo Fan's current situation, but he had no intention of doing anything about it. While Zhongde Immortal was paying a return visit to many of his friends who had visited him in the past 8 million years, in a void that was nearly 100 billion light years away from the place, where Zhongde Immortal lived in seclusion, a strange fluctuation was released from somewhere in the void and began to spread throughout the entire 5th level of the Tao Master's path. This location, nearly 100 billion light years away from the planet where Zhongde Immortal lived in seclusion, was actually one of the many forbidden areas for practitioners on the 5th level. Here, the void was extremely distorted, and the endless brilliance had become so intense that it directly created an unimaginable darkness, a darkness that was different from almost all other places on the entire 5th level. At first glance, the 5th level of the road to Tao Master looked like an endless universe. However, so long as one observed carefully, one would notice that everything in this universe, including the boundless pitch-black void, was constructed from boundless strange light. In other words, as long as one's eyesight was sharp enough, they would discover that the entire universe was actually emitting light at all times. There was no need to elaborate on how profound these lights were. Just their appearance and applicability alone was enough to show how extraordinary they were. At this moment, the structure of the countless rays of light in the void had been completely disrupted, causing the light here to be many times more intense than anywhere else. In the end, it created an incomparably deep and bizarre region that looked like the void of a universe, compared to the stability of the other areas. The light in this area was clearly extremely chaotic. Normal cultivators, even those who had condensed the embryonic form of the light of heaven and earth, would definitely not be able to stay in this area for long. Cultivators who had not condensed the embryonic form of the light of heaven and earth did not even have a right to enter this area. It was precisely because of this that this area was designated as a forbidden area by the cultivators on the 5th level. Usually, unless there was a special reason, very few cultivators would enter this forbidden area. Even if they could enter, they would do so as quickly as possible, and they would try their best to stay in this area as little as possible. However, this was only the situation 8 million years ago. During these 8 million years, the situation in this forbidden area had been completely overturned by someone. It had gained an additional ruler. This ruler had appeared for the first time 8 million years ago. The moment he appeared, the light of heaven and earth that was as bright as water was released from his body, directly covering the entire forbidden area. In an instant, it seeped into the depths of the forbidden area and left his mark on every inch of the forbidden area. Afterwards, he instantly drove away all the cultivators who had to come to the forbidden area to search for something or borrow the dangerous environment to cultivate. He directly announced to the entire 5th level that this was his territory. Whether it was the disciples of the Tao Masters or the independent cultivators on the 5th level, none of them could stand this kind of behavior that directly took over the public area as their own. Thus, during the 1 million years after the ruler occupied this area, countless cultivators came to talk to him. They wanted him to leave the forbidden area and return it to all the cultivators on the 5th level. However, it was a pity that the ruler did not care about these cultivators' requests. If the cultivators who tried to talk to him did not make a move, he would completely ignore them and pretend he did not hear them. However, once a cultivator tried to use forceful methods to drive the ruler away, the ruler would immediately retaliate. All sorts of methods that even the disciples of the Tao Masters could not imagine were displayed in his attacks. He easily crippled or drove away those cultivators. There were even a few times when he directly killed them. Just like that, the light continued for more than 1 million years. After more than 1 million years, the strongest disciple of the Tao Masters on the 5th level, the 5th senior brother, finally noticed this place and personally came to talk to the ruler. Whether it was the disciples of the Tao Masters or the independent cultivators, they all had great expectations for the 5th senior brother to make a move. In fact, some of the disciples of the Tao Masters who were familiar with the 5th senior brother even started to celebrate the reopening of the forbidden area. However, the final result shocked everyone. The 5th senior brother was in an extremely sorry state when faced with the ruler's methods. In the end, although he was able to use his various mysterious abilities to escape, he was still in an extremely sorry state. He was truly like a stray dog that had lost its home. As a result, the prestige of the ruler was immediately established. In the end, everyone had no choice but to admit that he was the ruler of the forbidden area. Of course, although the 5th senior brother retreated in a sorry state, his methods were still shocking, and his strength was unparalleled. Even if he could not compare to the ruler, he was still much stronger than countless other cultivators. As a result, through the battle with the ruler, he learned many things that the other cultivators did not. He learned that the ruler's name was Luo Fan, and that he was a cultivator that had recently ascended. He also learned that he was the cultivator that many of the disciples of the Tao Masters were looking for, the cultivator that might affect the position of the Tao Masters' disciples. It was also because of this that an existence like Taoist Zunhua was clearly aware of everything that had happened in the forbidden area. On this day, in the depths of the forbidden area, where the endless light was the brightest and also the darkest, Luo Fan sat with his legs crossed and stretched his body slightly. Countless mysterious auras flowed out from his body, causing the endless light around him to distort. It even caused the space in the 5th level to ripple strangely. I finally completely stabilized my cultivation. After a while, he recovered, and a satisfied look appeared on his face. After spending 8 million years and using the convenience of the forbidden area, he had finally digested all the things he had gained after going through the 6th tribulation, allowing his cultivation to completely break away from the early stage of the 6th tribulation and truly stand at the middle stage of the 6th tribulation. Of course, this was not a fixed level. It was just how stable he felt his cultivation was. The biggest change was that he could faintly sense the existence of the 7th Great Tribulation. Although the feeling was vague and faint, and he could not be sure how much time and how many years it would take, the fact that he could sense its existence was enough to show that he had completely stabilized his position as a 6th tribulation powerhouse. What a wonderful cultivation environment. Perhaps this forbidden area is the true essence of the 5th level. With this thought in mind, Luo Fan looked at the endless light around him, or rather, the endless darkness, and murmured. The reason why he could make such progress in 8 million years was not only because of his own efforts, but also because of the environment of the forbidden area. This forbidden area was an extremely dangerous place for other cultivators, even for the disciples of Tao Masters. because there was an extremely strong light that was similar to the light of heaven and earth here. This light actually existed in every corner of the entire fifth level. It existed in all the creatures, all the matter, and even all the energy in the fifth level. In fact, the countless rays of light that formed the entire fifth level were similar to the light of heaven and earth. This light had the appearance of the light of heaven and earth, and had many characteristics of the light of heaven and earth. If it was not for the fact that it did not have the will of heaven and earth that the light of heaven and earth should have, it would actually be the real light of heaven and earth. It was precisely because this was the nature of the light that countless cultivators could comprehend the nature of the light of heaven and earth by cultivating in this universe that was formed by countless rays of light. They could comprehend how to condense the light of heaven and earth. From this point of view, there should be endless benefits for cultivators to have such rich light in this forbidden area. However, it was obvious that things could not be considered from such a simple point of view. This kind of light was beneficial for cultivators to comprehend the light of heaven and earth, but it did not mean that the more this kind of light was, the more benefits it would bring. However, there was actually a limit to this. Under this limit, the more and more intense the light was, the more beneficial it would be to the cultivator's comprehension. However, once this limit was exceeded, the more and more intense the light was, the more dangerous it would be for the cultivator. And this limit was obviously close to the level of the endless matter, energy, and light contained in the boundless void in the entire fifth level. In other words, it was a level that was tens of thousands of times weaker than the light in the forbidden area. As a result, the amount of light in the forbidden area was clearly a disaster, not a good thing, for the cultivators in the forbidden area. If there were cultivators who could not resist the endless light here, as long as they stayed here for a certain amount of time, their bodies, power, and everything else would be corroded by the light, assimilated, and finally completely turned into a part of the light, disappearing without a trace. It was precisely because of this that this place was treated as a forbidden area. Of course, the mysteries of creation far exceeded the limits of living beings' imagination. Even though it was such a forbidden area, it wasn't completely empty. Because the light in this forbidden area was too intense, it produced all sorts of mysterious changes, forming all sorts of special places that could not be seen in the outside world. It could be space-time, world, heaven and earth, or even some kind of treasure. It was even possible that some strange creatures were born somewhere in this forbidden area. This kind of existence in the forbidden area was obviously very attractive to the cultivators in the outside world. It was said that in the past, a cultivator was extremely lucky and found a strange flower in this forbidden area. From it, he obtained all sorts of comprehension about the light of heaven and earth, and directly broke through the bottleneck. In just a few years, he had just condensed the embryonic form of the light of heaven and earth to the level of the light of heaven and earth completion. Because of this, even though they knew that this forbidden area was dangerous, there was almost no time for cultivators to rest. With this background, Luo Fan occupied this forbidden area and called himself the master of this forbidden area. Any cultivator who wanted to step into this forbidden area had to get his permission before they could do so. This was why there was such a fierce reaction, and even the fifth senior brother was finally alarmed. Fortunately, Luo Fan's current light of heaven and earth was definitely considered to be complete by the standards of the fifth level of the Tao Master's path. His strength had long been close to invincible in the fifth level. Therefore, even though there was such a huge reaction, he still firmly guarded this forbidden area, and now he had become a veritable master. As for the cultivators who wanted to enter this forbidden area to cultivate or search for opportunities, Luo Fan did not actually want anything from them. As long as those cultivators were willing to apply to him and were willing to abide by his rules, he would allow them to enter. In this way, for the cultivators on the fifth level, the addition of a master here did not affect them too much. At most, they would be restrained in name. Perhaps it was because of this that they gradually settled down and acknowledged Luo Fan's rule over this forbidden area. They were also willing to apply to Luo Fan before they entered. Because they had scruples, the situation in this forbidden area was more stable than before Luo Fan's arrival, and there were fewer killings. Chapter 2441. At the center of the forbidden area, Luo Fan was floating in the air. His light of heaven and earth was still floating behind his head like a group of worlds. The astonishing light in the forbidden area seemed to have incorporated the light of heaven and earth into its circulation system. It entered the light of heaven and earth from all directions and left the light of heaven and earth from another direction. Or, from another point of view, the light of heaven and earth had incorporated the endless light around it into its circulation system. In the process of the endless light being absorbed by the light of heaven and earth, the countless space-time, worlds, and heaven and earth inside the light of heaven and earth seemed to be absorbing some invisible nutrients, and its essence was constantly strengthening. The endless will of heaven and earth hidden in it seemed to be immersed in some kind of indescribable state of growth, as if it was constantly being replenished and climbing to a higher level. Through the imprint of the light of heaven and earth, the forbidden area was now almost completely under Luo Fan's control. He knew all the space-time, worlds, heaven and earth, treasures, and all kinds of strange natural landscapes in the forbidden area. As for the creatures that were adventuring in the forbidden area, he knew every single one of them. At this moment, there were a total of 37,000 cultivators in the forbidden area. Among them, there were only about 3,000 disciples of the Tao Master. The remaining 30,000 were all independent cultivators. Of course, this did not mean that the number of disciples of the Tao Master in the 5th level was much less than that of the independent cultivators. Instead, it was because the two had different attitudes towards the forbidden area. In fact, in the 5th level, the difference between the number of disciples of the Tao Master and the number of independent cultivators was not too big. Although the number of independent cultivators was slightly more than that of the Tao Master, the difference was only 1 or 2 times. The reason why the difference in the number of cultivators who entered the forbidden area to cultivate and search for opportunities was actually quite simple. It was because the disciples of the Tao Master did not trust Luo Fan. For them, the addition of a ruler like Luo Fan in this forbidden area was like having a sharp blade that could fall at any time. They had entered such a forbidden area, but they did not have the same sense of security that they had in the past. As a result, only a few of them were careless or had no choice but to come. Only then would they choose to cultivate in the forbidden area. In comparison, it was a different story for rogue cultivators. Although there were still many rogue cultivators who had doubts about Luo Fan's existence, there were more cultivators who felt that it would not affect them. After all, these rogue cultivators were originally looked down upon by the Tao Master's disciples. Almost everywhere, as long as they had enough value, they would be suppressed by the disciples of the Tao Master, and they would be inferior to the disciples of the Tao Master. In that case, what difference would it make to them if there was another ruler in the forbidden area? In fact, if one were to think about it from another perspective, the addition of this ruler would give them more confidence and safety in front of the Tao Master's disciples. From this point of view, it was actually a good thing. It was precisely because of this that the number of rogue cultivators in the forbidden area was not greatly affected. If this entire forbidden area was placed in an ordinary universe, it would actually be a black hole. An extremely strange black hole where even light could not escape its gravitational pull. In such a forbidden area, the various laws were actually very different from the 5th level in the outside world. It could even be said that it had formed a complete, independent small world. At this moment, Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat. In a flash, he had already arrived at an extremely special location in the forbidden area along with the light of heaven and earth. This location was not at the core of the Forbidden Land. Instead, it was quite a distance away from a core. At first glance, this place did not seem any different from other locations. In fact, since ancient times, not many cultivators had discovered the strangeness of this location. At the very least, with Luo Fan's current control over this forbidden area, he could sense that there had not been many auras left in this place since ancient times. Although his light of heaven and earth had moved, The connection between it and the surrounding light was still not severed. Even though it had shifted its position, it still continued to absorb the endless light around it, trying its best to absorb the mysterious principles and profundities contained in the light. How wonderful! Even the layer barriers have been distorted. Luo Fan could not help but sigh inwardly as he looked at the strange location in front of him. At first glance, this strange location did not seem any different from other locations. It was just like a very ordinary area in the forbidden area. However, with Luo Fan's eyesight, he could tell at a glance that the layer barriers in this location had already been greatly distorted. This distortion caused the many layers in this location to interweave together. Reality, existence, cause and effect, illusion, and so on. Countless layers had already completely intertwined here. This intertwining made this location seem extremely chaotic, causing the many layers in this location to connect with each other in the process. In fact, with his eyesight, he could even see the scenes of the many other layers. He narrowed his eyes, and his eyesight became extremely powerful. At this moment, the connections between the many other layers were instantly triggered, following which he saw countless reflections of himself in it. They were reflections of the existences that corresponded to him in the many layers. Under this reflection, he seemed to have become an indescribably mysterious existence. It was a mysterious existence that was eternal and indestructible. Even if the heavens and the earth were to perish and the chaos were to perish, it still wouldn't be able to shake him. This existence was so mysterious that it had an unimaginable attraction to him. He could not help but want to immerse himself in it and completely turn himself into the existence that was reflected in this reflection. This attraction was so powerful that it almost instantly broke through his rational defenses. He could not help but start moving his feet involuntarily. At this moment, the light in the world behind his head suddenly began to tremble. Following this tremble, a vast and boundless will directly swept through his mind. As it swept through his will, he instantly felt a chill in his heart. His originally hazy mind suddenly sobered up, and his eyes became clear again. After regaining his clarity, he suddenly felt a lingering fear. His gaze towards the strange location had already become extremely vigilant. Under this vigilance, when he looked at his reflection again, he no longer felt the irresistible impulse from before. He could finally see the existence that was like a reflection clearly. I was almost done for. I really can't be careless at all. This thought flashed through his mind. The reflection of the existences that corresponded to him in the many layers was indeed extremely mysterious. The eternal and indestructible aura that it gave off was not an illusion. If he really gathered all the existences of the various planes into one and completely fused with it, there was indeed a chance that he could obtain this kind of eternal indestructibility and indestructibility. However, the price that he would have to pay was far too great. It was so great that even thinking about it made his heart tremble. This was because the price was none other than his will and his freedom. There was naturally no need to say more about the price of his will. With Luo Fan's current level, with his current cultivation, although he could establish close connections with the existences that corresponded to him in the many layers, and could also transmit his will to the countless layers. However, in the end, it was only one layer of reality. Under such circumstances, if he were to fuse with the existences that corresponded to him in countless other planes, then his consciousness on the plane of reality would be equivalent to being covered by countless layers of gauze. His thoughts, all of them would be completely submerged by the various instincts brought about by the existences that corresponded to him in different planes. A single layer of gauze would already have some effect on one's vision. If countless layers of gauze were to be stacked together, the effect would be obvious. It would definitely directly cover his vision. In other words, it would completely imprison his will. At that time, even if he obtained eternal and indestructible aura, what could he do? How could he still be him? At most, he would be a walking corpse. Just this point alone was enough to make Luo Fan not dare to make this choice. Moreover, there was also another point. After fusing, his freedom would be greatly restricted. After all, the reason why the existences that corresponded to him in the many layers could meet was because of this rather special location. Under such circumstances, once he fused here, if he wanted to leave this place, he would be obstructed by all the layers. The pulling force of the countless layers on the existences that belonged to him would firmly fix him in this place, unable to escape, unable to leave. Even if he disregarded everything and wanted to challenge the pulling force of the countless layers, in the end, the biggest possibility was that he would tear himself apart again, and once again separate the existences that corresponded to him in the various layers. This was still a possibility that he could think about rationally. If another weakness was added, that is, what would be submerged and imprisoned, leaving only his instincts to control the body formed by the existences that corresponded to him in the various layers, then the possibility of splitting again would be completely eliminated. After all, if only his instincts were left, how could his body seek to split itself again? Without such a firm will, naturally, he would not be able to use the pulling force to tear his body apart again and turn into the countless existences in the countless layers. Fortunately, Luo Fan secretly rejoiced at this moment. He turned back to look at the light of heaven and earth, and found that it had not changed at all compared to before, as if nothing had happened. As for the changes that occurred in the light of heaven and earth, just now, Luo Fan was quite clear about what was going on. That was the will of heaven and earth in the light of heaven and earth. After realizing that he had lost his rationality and done something that was extremely dangerous to himself, woke him up. The will of heaven and earth in the light of heaven and earth was indeed unable to communicate with Luo Fan. But that did not mean that the will of heaven and earth was useless, and it did not mean that the will of heaven and earth could not weigh and think. In fact, the reason why he could not communicate with the will of heaven and earth was only because his level of thinking was completely different from that of the will of heaven and earth. Whether it was knowledge or rationality, the will of heaven and earth was far superior to Luo Fan. Under such circumstances, the will of heaven and earth still prevented Luo Fan from stepping into that strange place, which was enough to show how dangerous this action was. After all, the will of heaven and earth did not care about Luo Fan's various suicidal actions in the Great Tribulation, and it did not even touch him at all. After watching for a while, Luo Fan shifted his gaze from the light of heaven and earth to another direction. In that direction, in a place that was millions of kilometers away, there was a being that was asking him for instructions. It was an itinerant cultivator. An itinerant cultivator who had already formed the embryonic form of the light of heaven and earth, but had not truly formed it. This itinerant cultivator was currently on a strange continent. From the outside, this continent only looked like a piece of soil with a circumference of several thousand feet. However, as long as one stepped onto the surface of this piece of soil, one would discover that its volume had increased by billions of times. It was a vast and boundless continent, a continent that gave birth to countless living beings, a large number of civilizations, and even nurtured a large number of cultivators. At this moment, this itinerant cultivator was on a peak of this continent, asking Luo Fan for instructions, or rather, pleading. The itinerant cultivator knelt on the ground and said anxiously, "Ruler, please lower the curtains and save my Tao partner. I am willing to give you all my assets." His embryonic form of the light of heaven and earth seemed to be boiling at this moment, constantly rising and retracting on the surface of his body. As it rose and retracted, a strange wave was transmitted along with his words, converging into the endless darkness around the continent. In other words, it was the endless light that could only be reversed when things reached an extreme. Finally, it was transmitted to where Luo Fan was, and Luo Fan heard it. "Begging me to save her? Don't tell me you're treating me like a babysitter?" Luo Fan frowned, and he was shocked. He had indeed saved people before. However, in this forbidden area, he had never made a move. If that was the case, why did this person think that he would save his Tao partner? Chapter 2442. This forbidden area was now under Luo Fan's complete control. This kind of control was not enough for him to completely comprehend all the mysteries and mysteries of this forbidden area. However, when it came to deducing what a cultivator had experienced here, it was only a matter of a thought. At this moment, Chunheng's heart skipped a beat. The various experiences of this cultivator after entering the forbidden area flashed before his eyes like a movie. Through these scenes, Chunheng understood what the cultivator's Tao companion had experienced and where she was now. I didn't expect to have such a fortuitous encounter. It's a pity that he didn't have enough insight and couldn't see through it. After understanding all of this, Luo Fan could not help but sigh. In actuality, the cultivator's Tao companion did not encounter any misfortune or fall into a hopeless situation as the cultivator had imagined. Instead, she had obtained some kind of astonishing, fortuitous encounter. At this moment, not far away from the mountain the cultivator was on, there was a deep and unfathomable abyss that was emitting boundless cold air. This cold air was extremely strange. It was like a living creature, lingering at the entrance of the abyss without dispersing at all. Due to this structure, the cold air within the abyss had already completely frozen space. However, the air outside the abyss did not feel the slightest bit cold at this moment. The cultivator's Tao companion was inside the abyss. She was like a statue, quietly floating tens of thousands of kilometers above the ground. This abyss was surrounded by blooming flowers. It looked extremely beautiful, making this valley look like a paradise on earth. Back then, it was because of the beauty of this place that the cultivator's Tao companion was interested in. As a result, she accidentally hid in the abyss and was frozen by the cold air, making her look like a dead statue. From then until now, more than 300,000 years had passed. During these 300,000 years, that cultivator had tried everything he could think of. There were even a few times when his embryonic light of heaven and earth had almost collapsed, let alone the fellow Taoist he was acquainted with. Even if he had only met them once, he had shamelessly begged them for their help. But in the end, he was utterly unable to rescue his Tao companion from the abyss. In fact, let alone fishing it out, even if he sent any of his power into the abyss, it would be frozen by the abyss. If he reacted a little slower, it wouldn't just be his power that would be frozen. Even his body, his spirit, and his essence would be frozen. It was precisely because the 300,000 years had not yielded any results that the cultivator had no choice but to place his last hope on the ruler of this forbidden land. I've been guarding my Taoist companion, who thinks she's a corpse for over 300,000 years. Luo Fan sighed with emotion. 300,000 years was not a long time for cultivators, but it also depended on the time. In terms of the cultivator's current state, 300,000 years was not much different from 3,030 billion years. After all, every minute and second spent in this position was an indescribable torment for him. However, even in this torment, the cultivator did not waver at all. In the end, he even made Luo Fan the target of his pleas. Luo Fan could not help but admire his deep feelings for his Taoist companion. Forget it. Since that's the case, I'll give you a chance. With a thought, Luo Fan released a projection that directly condensed on the mountain peak on the continent. At this moment, the cultivator was kneeling on the ground and begging. His voice was close to tears, and his body was filled with an increasingly intense sense of despair. Under these circumstances, Luo Fan's projection directly appeared in front of him, but it took a long time for him to catch his attention. When he raised his head and saw Luo Fan, he could not help but reveal a hint of joy amidst the despair. He kowtowed vigorously and cried out, "Thank you, ruler! Thank you, ruler!" Obviously, he had already confirmed Luo Fan's appearance through various means, so he could confirm Luo Fan's identity when he first appeared. The cultivator's face was already covered in tears as he spoke, and his forehead had even begun to bleed. Obviously, an expert who had condensed the embryonic form of the light of heaven and earth was able to kowtow until his head bled, which was enough to show how promising he was. As he spoke, he directly opened up the countless worlds that he had opened up and said, "These are all my possessions. and I'm willing to offer them all. I only hope that ruler can save my Taoist companion. Each of the countless worlds had its own characteristics. They contained all kinds of mysterious structures, and there were countless mysterious creatures in them. There were also all kinds of mysterious things hidden in them that Luo Fan had never heard of before. It could be said that these worlds alone were already of considerable value. If these worlds were taken to the fourth level of the Tao Master's path, it would definitely be enough to cause all the cultivators there, whether they were disciples of the Tao Master or independent cultivators, to fight to the death for them. However, these were obviously meaningless to Luo Fan. To him, he could create everything that this cultivator before him could offer with a single thought. In fact, the things that he created would definitely be more mysterious and precious than anything that this cultivator could offer. He smiled faintly and said, "I'm not interested in your possessions. I already know about your Taoist companion. She isn't facing any danger right now, but she has encountered an opportunity for her cultivation. Based on her current state, she will return in about 3 million years. When that time comes, not only will she be able to completely form the light of heaven and earth, she might even bring some unexpected treasures." Hearing this, the cultivator could not help but be stunned. Instinctively, a look of disbelief appeared on his face. After all, what Luo Fan said was just too unimaginable. His Taoist companion had clearly turned into a dead object in the abyss. So why was this person saying that it was not misfortune or a hopeless situation, but an opportunity? It's not that I don't believe the ruler. It's just that the ruler's words are too unbelievable. The cultivator muttered. Luo Fan continued to smile and said, "You'll know if it's unbelievable or not after a while. It's only 3 million years. It's not that long." Hearing this, the cultivator nodded instinctively. Although he still had some doubts about what Luo Fan said, he was still given hope, allowing him to vent a lot of the pressure in his heart. As such, although the weight was still unbearable, it was much easier than before. If he waited with this mentality, 3 million years was indeed not that long. "Thank you for your guidance, ruler. If it's true, then this junior's life is in your hands," the cultivator said straightforwardly. "Why would I want your life?" Luo Fan smiled and shook his head. "I'm just helping you because you can protect your Taoist companion for half a year." As he spoke, his heart trembled slightly, and his figure slowly dispersed. When the cultivator saw that Luo Fan really didn't ask for anything, he was stunned for a moment. Then he smiled bitterly and kowtowed in the direction Luo Fan had disappeared, kowtowing 9 times in a row. Although Luo Fan had only given him a few words and pointed out another possibility, this had completely changed the fate of both him and his wife. He wouldn't sink into despair, and his wife would have a chance to meet again. To them, this was an enormous favor. The cultivator was naturally indescribably grateful and didn't dare forget about it. He'd already made up his mind. In the future, he would definitely repay the ruler's kindness after doing this. Luo Fan didn't withdraw his attention. Instead, he threw himself into the depths of the abyss in the valley not far away and dived towards the deepest part of the abyss. The cold air in the abyss was actually an extremely wondrous existence. It was actually a product of the light of heaven and earth that had mutated. This light of heaven and earth was extremely wondrous. It was vastly different from all the light of heaven and earth that Luo Fan had seen before. Most light of heaven and earth was pure light. Although it had all sorts of mysteries, it was still just a carrier of the will of the world. However, the light of heaven and earth in the abyss was completely different. This light of heaven and earth had already lost its balance. The concept of cold that belonged to the light of heaven and earth had already expanded tens of thousands of times. Because of the expansion of this concept of cold, the nature of the light of heaven and earth changed. In the end, it turned into this cold air that lingered in the abyss and couldn't be dispersed. Under these circumstances, anything that fell into the abyss would actually be suppressed by the light of heaven and earth. If there wasn't anything special, it would definitely be erased immediately. Whether it was power, concepts, ideas, or anything else, it was the same. From this perspective, The fact that the cultivator's cultivation companion could still maintain her figure after falling into the abyss for 300,000 years was enough to show how extraordinary she was. With Luo Fan's ability, after discovering the extraordinariness of this cultivator, he was naturally able to deduce the extraordinariness of this cultivator immediately. In fact, the reason why this woman could still survive in the abyss was because the path she cultivated was similar to this cold Tao. Of course, it was not the cold Tao that ordinary living beings understood. Instead, it was the cold Tao that was more profound, more advanced, and tens of thousands of times more profound. This cold Tao was enough to freeze the universe, freeze concepts, and freeze concepts. Because of the cold Tao that she cultivated, she had an unimaginable affinity with the light of heaven and earth that had lost balance. As a result, after she fell into the abyss, although she was constantly being eroded by the light of heaven and earth, she was also resonating with the light of heaven and earth, allowing her light of heaven and earth fledgling form to constantly absorb nutrients from the light of heaven and earth in the outside world. The erosion of the light of heaven and earth that had lost balance caused the woman to fall into a state where she was close to death. It made her seem like a statue or a corpse. The light of heaven and earth fledgling form absorbed nutrients from the light of heaven and earth in the outside world. Not only did it keep her alive, but also allowed her to constantly immerse herself in the various experiences brought about by the light of heaven and earth. Not only did it allow her light of heaven and earth fledgling form to grow continuously, but it also allowed her to grow continuously. I didn't expect the light of heaven and earth to change like this. Looks like my understanding of the light of heaven and earth is still lacking. Luo Fan looked at the scene in the abyss and could not help but sigh. His understanding of the light of heaven and earth was derived from his own understanding of the world and his understanding of cultivation. The results of these deductions were enough for him to use the light of heaven and earth to become much more powerful than almost all the other cultivators on the 5th level. He did not need to belittle himself in this regard. However, he had to admit that the results of his deductions were still lacking in certain aspects. At the very least, his deductions were far from enough in terms of the various small applications. At this moment, the fact that the light of heaven and earth could possess such astonishing properties through the loss of balance was a great revelation to him. It instantly opened up a new world, allowing him to be filled with countless inspirations. While he was comprehending, the cluster of worlds formed by the light of heaven and earth behind his main body's head suddenly underwent all sorts of indescribable changes. The originally pure light suddenly turned into ice, then into flames, then into green wood, then into soil, then into strange metals, then into nothingness, then into clouds, then into countless runes. Looking over, it was as if the light of heaven and earth had suddenly become all things in the world. Furthermore, the changes were not just on the surface. Instead, it was a fundamental change that went deep into the light of heaven and earth, and even reached deep into the world's will. When the light of heaven and earth turned into ice and cold chi, the entire light of heaven and earth looked like a piece of ice and a ball of cold chi. When it turned into flames, it would become a real ball of fire. This went on and on. No matter what the light of heaven and earth turned into, it would be a complete and fundamental change. After the change, there would be no trace of the original light of heaven and earth at all. In just a few breaths' time, countless changes appeared on the light of heaven and earth behind Luo Fan's head. Eventually, all the changes disappeared, and the light of heaven and earth turned into a cluster of worlds again, hovering behind his head. However, compared to before, the cluster of worlds seemed to have undergone some subtle changes as well. It seemed like each world had become more realistic and complete. At the same time, Luo Fan felt a strange sense of smoothness in his heart. It was as if the artificial limbs that were attached to his body had become his real limbs. Chapter 2443. At this moment, Luo Fan felt that his connection with the light of heaven and earth had reached a certain stage of perfection. In this state of perfection, he felt that his maximum strength had not improved much, but his average strength had grown by leaps and bounds. In the past, he could only use the light of heaven and earth to exert some of its power, and he might not even be able to control how it was exerted. He could only make use of the light of heaven and earth in a general manner. As for other aspects, he could only rely on his own divine sense, his own power, and his own ability to complete them. The result of this was that once he exerted the power of the light of heaven and earth, other living beings could only use stronger light of heaven and earth to crack it. On the other hand, it was much easier to break through the various tricks that he had used his own divine abilities, his own power, and his own abilities to do. It could almost be said that any light of heaven and earth could easily crack it. Now that his connection with the light of heaven and earth had reached a certain stage of perfection, his control over the light of heaven and earth had become many times more precise. He could now easily use the light of heaven and earth to perform countless techniques that he could only rely on himself in the past. In this way, if he wanted to crack the various techniques, he could obviously only rely on the more powerful light of heaven and earth to do it. This obviously meant that his average strength had been greatly enhanced. I didn't expect to get such a reward from a moment of temptation. Luo Fan smiled slightly. He stared at the continent and once again saw the valley and the woman in the abyss. At this moment, the cultivator who had previously prayed to him had already built a hut in the valley. Although there was still an unconcealable worry between his brows, it was many times better than the despair he had felt before. Obviously, Luo Fan's words had pulled him out of the abyss of despair. Where does this ray of light of heaven and earth come from? Luo Fan had not thought much about it before, but now he was inexplicably curious. The light of heaven and earth was mysterious and generally existed by relying on the cultivator. If it was separated from the cultivator, the will of heaven and earth contained within the light of heaven and earth would naturally urge the light of heaven and earth to evolve and eventually turn into a world, a heaven and earth, or even a group of worlds. This situation was actually very common on the 5th level of the Tao Master's path. Just like in this forbidden area, there were actually many dangerous places in the forbidden area that had evolved from the embryonic form of the light of heaven and earth left behind by the cultivator who had died. Even the continent that Luo Fan was paying attention to at this moment seemed to have evolved from the combination of the light of heaven and earth left behind by a fallen cultivator and the endless light in the forbidden area. Under such circumstances, the light of heaven and light could actually maintain its original structure after it was condensed from the light of heaven and earth left behind by its condenser, and still retain the appearance of the light of heaven and earth. In particular, in world's earth what was still within heaven and light of earth. This light of heaven and earth was that chi. This time in God, the chi in and earth began to surge. And earth, and chi, and earth that, and in spirit, and in spirit of God, and in chi. Is this light of heaven and earth responding to my perception? At this moment, Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat, and such a realization came to him. The light of heaven and earth had been here for hundreds of millions of years, and it had never changed. At this time, when Luo Fan's perception began to investigate its source, it would be an insult to Luo Fan's intelligence to say that it was a coincidence. Do you have anything to tell me? Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat, and he transmitted this thought through the light of heaven and earth. At this moment, the cold chi in the abyss began to surge violently. Countless pieces of information quickly surged towards Luo Fan through his perception in an instant. At this moment, Luo Fan felt as if there was a boundless wave of information rushing towards him. If he had not reacted quickly and hid his spirit behind the light of heaven and earth, the wave of information alone might have been enough to overturn his spirit and cause irreversible consequences. As expected, the will of the world is still powerful. Luo Fan could not help but sigh as he sensed the overwhelming wave of information. When he saw the cold chi on the surface of the abyss wriggling like a living thing, he had already guessed how much of the will of the world remained in the light of heaven and earth. Now, this overwhelming wave of information had confirmed his original guess. The wave of information seemed terrifying and unbelievable, but in reality, it was just a normal exchange of information between the will of the world. In terms of the will of a living being, this might be equivalent to a greeting like hello. However, even so, for Luo Fan, who only had the will of a living being, even a greeting from the will of the world was unbearable and incomprehensible to him. At this moment, he could only use the light of heaven and earth as a medium and try his best to use the will of the world to receive and translate the information, turning it into information that he could understand as much as possible. This method would, of course, cause the information he received to suffer a huge loss and become incomplete. However, this was the only way he could understand the information. His level was not high enough. Being able to use this roundabout method to communicate with the will of the world was already a miraculous method to turn the impossible into the possible. How could he ask for more? After being translated by the light of heaven and earth, the information was turned into countless messy information fragments that interweave together, allowing Luo Fan to comprehend it as if he was comprehending the mysteries of cultivation. In the end, after a long period of comprehension, he finally extracted some meaningful information fragments from the information. Through these fragments, he knew that the will of the world was asking him for help. To be more precise, it was asking him for help on behalf of its master. When he comprehended this information, Luo Fan could not help but feel surprised. He did not even dare to believe that this was what the information was conveying. At that moment, he let his consciousness of the light of heaven and earth communicate with the consciousness of the light of heaven and earth again. After receiving a few more messages and comprehending a few more times, he had no choice but to believe that the light of heaven and earth was indeed asking him for help. Is it really treating me as a babysitter? Asking for help here, asking for help there? Luo Fan felt helpless for a moment. He only felt that his identity had been misunderstood. The communication between the wills of the world was extremely complicated, and the information contained in every sentence was extremely complicated. As long as one tried to comprehend it, the information that one could obtain was definitely not limited to what was expressed on the surface. Instead, it contained countless deeper meanings that could be unearthed. For example, at this moment, Luo Fan only needed to comprehend the information from the direction that he had comprehended. Very soon, he had already understood the cause and effect of the cry for help. The master of the light of heaven and earth was a powerful cultivator. He had already condensed his light of heaven and earth, and was even a cultivator who had the right to ascend. This cultivator had passed by this forbidden area hundreds of millions of years ago, and on a whim, he stepped into this forbidden area in search of fortuitous opportunities. In the end, he arrived at this continent and discovered that there was a certain strange distortion on this continent. From that distortion, he sensed that he had obtained an opportunity to break through, so he charged into that distortion without any hesitation. However, the development of the matter was completely different from what the cultivator had expected. After he charged into that distortion, his body was instantly ignited by some kind of light of heaven and earth transformed into flames, and he instantly turned into nothingness. Fortunately, the cultivator's light of heaven and earth reacted on its own in the end. It turned into cold air to resist the earth-shattering flames of the light of heaven and earth, protecting the last bit of this being's mark. It would have been fine if things had ended here. After all, for an existence that had condensed light of heaven and earth, as long as there was a bit of mark left, it would only take a thought for him to recover everything. However, this was only the beginning. Next, the depths of the distortion produced a strange suction force that directly sucked the cultivator's mark into the depths of the distortion. It almost completely severed the connection between the mark and the light of heaven and earth. No matter how hard the light of heaven and earth tried, it could not find the mark, let alone restore its master. If it was not for the faint connection between the mark and the light of heaven and earth, allowing the light of heaven and earth to not completely sever its connection with its master, perhaps the light of heaven and earth would have thought that its master had died. From that time until now, who knew how many hundreds of millions of years had passed? Over the long period of time, the light of heaven and earth had been trying its best to reconnect with its master and recall its master's imprint. But in the end, no matter how hard it tried, it couldn't do it. In fact, the reason why a female cultivator had fallen into this abyss this time was because the light of heaven and earth was trying something else. It planned to groom a cultivator and let that cultivator enter the depths of the distortion to find its master. It was because of this that the woman had fallen into the abyss by chance. And it was also because of this that she had coincidentally been in a state of balance. Without Luo Fan, the woman's light of heaven and earth would definitely have taken form after 3 million years. When that time came, she would have been sent into the depths of the distortion to help the light of heaven and earth find its master's mark. However, it was clear that Luo Fan's appearance had given the light of heaven and earth another option. A better option. Even if the woman had taken form after 3 million years, she would only be a cultivator who was slightly inferior to the light of heaven and earth's master. Although there was a chance for the light of heaven and earth to find its master by sending her into the depths of the distortion, the chances were too slim. It could almost be said that it would not succeed. In comparison, Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth had reached a certain peak, and it was many times more powerful than the light of heaven and earth that had turned into the abyss. Luo Fan's control over the light of heaven and earth was not something that its master could compare to. No matter how one looked at it, Luo Fan was clearly a better target to seek help from to save its master. Of course, even so, if Luo Fan had not extended his perception over again, the light of heaven and earth would not have sought help from Luo Fan. After all, having the ability to save someone and being willing to save someone were two different things. Previously, Luo Fan had only extended his perception over to see what was going on here, and to see what was going on with the woman who had been dragged into the abyss by the light of heaven and earth. It had nothing to do with the light of heaven and earth, much less its master. Even if the light of heaven and earth was desperate, it would not target Luo Fan. However, the situation was different this time. This time, Luo Fan extended his perception over again. Through that perception, the light of heaven and earth instantly discovered that Luo Fan had gained some sort of understanding from the light of heaven and earth. This way, although it would not establish an unbreakable connection with the light of heaven and earth and its master, there would still be some karma. This karma was not strong, but it was enough for the light of heaven and earth to ask for help. As long as Luo Fan's nature was not too bad, even if he did not agree to help the light of heaven and earth save its master, he would not add insult to injury. With the way the will of heaven and earth thought, this foundation was clearly enough for it to ask for help. Let me see what special distortion there is. A curious look appeared on Luo Fan's face. Previously, he had already seen a distortion that had opened up many layers in this forbidden area. Now, there was another distortion here. How could he not be curious? It can't be another distortion that opened up many layers of barriers, right? With that thought, his perception began to penetrate the depths of the continent, and he wanted to explore the deepest part of the abyss. Very soon, he was at the center of the continent, facing the bottom of the abyss, and he sensed the existence of that distortion. This distortion was so strange that the surrounding strata also showed all sorts of strange distortions because of the existence of this distortion. This distortion kept spreading in all directions, and the further out it went, the smaller the distortion. In the end, when it spread to the entire continent, the distortion had completely disappeared. This simply looked like the location of this distortion was the core of this continent, as if it was the source of this continent. Chapter 2444. Previously, Luo Fan had already guessed the reason for the formation of this continent. He knew that it was very likely that a cultivator who had condensed the light of heaven and earth had died here. However, why would a cultivator who had condensed the light of heaven and earth die here? even though the environment of the forbidden area was extremely harsh for ordinary cultivators. That was only true for ordinary cultivators. For cultivators who had condensed the light of heaven and earth, the dangers in the forbidden area were actually nothing much. At the very least, this was the case for ordinary forbidden areas that did not have anything special. As a result, there were only two possibilities for a cultivator to die in this area. Firstly, there were cultivators fighting there. Due to the death of one of the cultivators, the embryonic form of light lost control. Due to that, the will of the world began controlling the embryonic form of light to evolve. In the end, it transformed into this self-contained continent. Secondly, there was something special about this place. In other words, it was not an ordinary place. If Luo Fan did not know that there was a distorted place here, he would naturally think that the first possibility was more likely. However, now that he knew that there was a distorted place here, there was no need to say which possibility was more likely. A cultivator actually died here in the past. No wonder this place has not been discovered after so many years, and not many cultivators have stopped to cultivate here. Luo Fan thought to himself. A strange expression appeared on his face. After all, even though this forbidden area was rather vast, it was only for ordinary living beings. For cultivators who could condense the light of heaven and earth, this forbidden area was not very big at all. If they really made up their minds, it would not be difficult for them to find a special place or a place with opportunities. This was especially true after the accumulation of countless years. It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan was surprised that the distorted land, which connected many layers together, had not been discovered at that time. However, that location looked very ordinary after all. Apart from Luo Fan, who could communicate with many sovereigns, no other cultivators could sense anything unusual about it. Even if someone came close to it, as long as they didn't personally step into it, they wouldn't be able to discover anything special. Comparatively speaking, it was still excusable. However, the distortion in the depths of the continent was obviously completely different. This distortion couldn't be more obvious. Not to mention cultivators who could condense the light of heaven and earth. Even ordinary living beings would be able to notice the distortion at a glance. They would be able to know what was special and unusual about that place. However, after so many years, this place had not been discovered. Only a pair of Taoist companions had stayed here for a while because of the wonderful environment. The others were all ordinary living beings born on this continent. No matter how one looked at it, this situation was because this continent was concealing them. With a slight thought, Luo Fan's figure flashed, and he had already crossed more than half of the forbidden area. He directly arrived at the depths of this continent, and arrived at the location where the distortion was. The composition of this continent was extremely strange, at least in the 5th level of the Tao Master's Road. It looked extremely strange. This was because the way it existed was similar to the way the continents in ordinary worlds existed. It was not woven by countless light rays that were similar to the light of heaven and earth, but was constructed by ordinary matter. At least, this was the case in the beginning. After countless years of development, the rules of the forbidden area had gradually seeped into this continent, causing the fundamental composition of this continent to be affected. Now, it had some characteristics that belonged to the forbidden area. In other words, in the depths, there were traces of light weaving and construction that were similar to the light of heaven and earth. However, this was nothing to Luo Fan at all. At this moment, when he came here, he did not even need to push away the surrounding soil. The natural way of existence was as if the surrounding matter was simply an illusion. It was more like he was in a completely different dimension from the surrounding soil. When he arrived here, a strange feeling appeared in his heart. The distortion in front of him seemed to have a force that was both repulsive and attractive to him. Under this strange force, he felt uncomfortable here. He wanted to immerse himself in it, but he also had an urge to immediately leave. I can't believe I have this feeling. Is it because I am a ruler, or because my light of heaven and earth is far stronger than that cultivator? Or That amazing suction is just an effect on the brand? Luo Fan stood here with an inexplicable look of doubt on his face. Luo Fan stood here quietly and began to explore the distortion with his perception. The reason why he didn't use his perception to probe this distortion from the center, which was extremely far away from this position, but instead came to the vicinity of this distortion to probe this distortion, was actually quite simple. It was because his body here would cause a corresponding change in the distortion. And this kind of change was not something that could be sensed from afar. The moment his perception probed into the distortion, an incomparably intense, burning pain appeared at this moment. Following Luo Fan's perception, it quickly rushed to his mind, and in the blink of an eye, he was completely submerged. With a thought, a powerful will instantly poured in, and the burning pain that drowned him instantly became almost illusory. For him, who had a perfect temperament, the existence of pain was like a spring breeze. As long as he wanted to, he could easily erase it. As he erased the burning pain, he understood what his perception had experienced in the distortion. The distortion did not contain the flames that the cultivator had encountered in the past. Instead, it contained an incomparably pure, crushing force formed by the light of heaven and earth. This kind of power appeared out of nowhere within the distortion and directly crushed his perception, ruthlessly crushing it. His perception had already become scattered in an instant. And this incomparably pure, crushing force didn't stop right away. Instead, it continued to take effect. However, the target was no longer his perception. Instead, it followed the connection between his perception and crossed the air, wanting to completely crush his body. Fortunately, Luo Fan had already used his light of heaven and earth to protect himself. This crushing force was intercepted by the light of heaven and earth and did not reach his body at all. Otherwise, his body would have already been crushed by the burning pain. As expected, the light of heaven and earth can resist this distortion. Seeing this, Luo Fan nodded to himself. Ever since he came here, he had already considered his own safety. After all, he had come here to explore the mysteries of the distortion and save the cultivator who had entered it. However, he had not come here to lose his life. Under these circumstances, if he did not have enough confidence, how could he have appeared here with his true body? The reason why he dared to come so decisively was because he was confident that his light of heaven and earth could protect him and prevent him from being affected by the distortion. As for why he was so confident, the reason was even simpler. It was because of the existence of the abyss above. The abyss was formed by the light of heaven and earth, and it had existed here for hundreds of millions of years. This clearly represented the fact that the distortion could not do anything to the light of heaven and earth. And obviously, Luo Fan did not think that his light of heaven and earth, which had been tempered by the sixth great tribulation, would be inferior to the light of heaven and earth that had turned into the abyss. Even the light of heaven and earth that had turned into the abyss was not affected by the distortion. Could it be that his light of heaven and earth could also be affected by the distortion? It was precisely because he had such confidence that he directly came to the vicinity of the distortion and appeared in the vicinity of the distortion. Gather. With a thought, Luo Fan said to himself. Then, in the distortion, the countless senses that were continuously being crushed by the pure light of heaven and earth instantly gathered together. Although they were quickly crushed by the crushing force again, he had already taken advantage of this time to roughly see the situation inside the distortion. The inside of the distortion was not like what he saw from the outside. It was just a distorted area with a radius of several meters. However, there was a boundless void inside. It was a place filled with strange darkness. There was no end, and nothing could be found. It was the void. The pure crushing force was derived from the boundless darkness around him. Of course, the time was too short after all, and he was completely crushed in the next instant. Therefore, he still did not see how the crushing force was born from the surroundings. He also did not know where the mark that he had entered was. Darkness. Luo Fan did not gather his senses again. He began to recall everything that he had seen in a flash, and a look of hesitation appeared on his face. This kind of hesitation was extremely rare to see on his face, since who knew how many years ago he no longer had any hesitation on his face. However, the situation inside actually made him hesitate. This was enough to show how troublesome the problem that the boundless darkness had brought to him was. However, Luo Fan was Luo Fan, after all. The hesitation did not appear on his face for too long. Very soon, he had brazenly stepped into the distortion. It was not just his body that had stepped into it. His body, along with the light of heaven and earth that he had condensed, had stepped into it at the same time. At this moment, he suddenly felt a boundless crushing force surging towards him from all around him, acting crazily on his light of heaven and earth. The crushing force was so terrifying that even with the protection of the light of heaven and earth, he still felt that his body was under incredible pressure. There were even cracking sounds coming from his body, as if his body was going to collapse in the next moment. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan did not feel worried at all, nor did he have any thoughts of going back immediately. Instead, he guarded himself and allowed the light of heaven and earth to undergo countless changes in that instant. It made the light around his body seem to have suddenly become all things in the world, emitting endless, dazzling brilliance. It was incomparably gorgeous and incomparably mysterious. A strong fighting spirit was released from the light of heaven and earth, affecting Luo Fan's soul. He suddenly felt an extremely strong urge to fight in his heart. He could not wait to rush out of the light of heaven and earth into the boundless crushing force around him and fight it, even if he was just an ant in the face of the terrifying crushing force outside. It was still the same. Faced with such a terrifying fighting spirit, Luo Fan quickly sobered up and used his extremely firm Taoist heart to suppress the endless and even more overwhelming fighting spirit. It made him feel as if he was imprisoned and firmly fixed within the light of heaven and earth. Even though his body had already turned red, he did not move at all. He was very clear that this fighting spirit came from the will of the world, not from his heart. If he gave in to this fighting spirit, it would be equivalent to being controlled by the light of heaven and earth. It would be equivalent to losing himself. For Luo Fan, who wholeheartedly wanted to become a true sage, this was clearly unacceptable. Even if he could survive by rushing out like this, he would definitely not choose to do so. Moreover, rushing out like this was simply courting death while resisting this endless and overwhelming fighting spirit. Luo Fan completely ignored the passage of time in the outside world. All he could think about was calmness, maintaining his consciousness, and maintaining his own autonomy. After an unknown period of time, which seemed to be tens of millions of years, or perhaps hundreds of trillions of years, he gradually broke away from that fighting spirit and slowly extracted a bit of independent thinking. It was not that the fighting spirit transmitted by the will of the world had weakened. Instead, his soul had become more stable and could already resist the fighting spirit transmitted by the will of the world. While resisting this fighting spirit, he could also regain his normal thinking ability. Is this considered a blessing in disguise? After gradually regaining his ability to think, an inexplicable and complicated expression appeared on Luo Fan's face. At this moment, he suddenly reflected on his various actions over the years. He seemed to have been a little too reliant on the light of heaven and earth these days. Chapter 2445. The root of cultivation is still oneself. External objects can be borrowed, but they can't be relied on. Even if the light of heaven and earth is condensed to the limit, it's just another innate, inextinguishable spiritual light at most. Placing the focus of cultivation on evolving the light of heaven and earth is ultimately putting the cart before the horse. After a long while, Luo Fan sighed and looked at the outside world through the light of heaven and earth. After countless years of evolution, the surroundings of the light of heaven and earth were no longer as boundless as before. Instead, They had turned into extremely strange light and shadows. At a glance, it seemed like a complete world had been completely broken apart and then randomly glued together. It was strange and fantastical. Of course, the result of this change also caused the originally extremely pure, crushing power of the light of heaven and earth to go through a tremendous change. The originally pure, crushing force had already undergone countless transformations and had changed in countless different ways. It was truly as if everything in the world was launching attacks at him. Moreover, this was not an ordinary attack. Instead, it was an attack that displayed the corresponding changes in nature after the light of heaven and earth broke the balance that Luo Fan had previously comprehended. It was an attack that could make all living beings without the light of heaven and earth defenseless. Facing all of this, Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth evolved naturally, also giving rise to billions of corresponding changes, blocking the countless light and shadows in the outside world, as well as the countless attacks. Of course, compared to the strange and fantastical scene in the outside world, the changes of the light of heaven and earth were completely different. The light and shadows that were born from the corresponding changes of the light of heaven and earth formed a complete and harmonious world. At a glance, it was as if a certain part of the world group was directly exposed. Looking at this scene, Luo Fan's heart was filled with even greater curiosity. What exactly was this place? What was the surrounding darkness? Why did it give rise to all these changes to attack him? Were the existences that entered this place previously? These various doubts kept circulating in his heart, causing his senses to start searching purposefully. The changes in the surroundings were so intense that there would definitely be a lot of information leaking out. Perhaps he would be able to find some of the answers he was looking for. If it was before, he would definitely set his target on the light of heaven and earth and rely on the various information obtained from the will of the world within the light of heaven and earth to find the answer. However, after realizing that he was putting the cart before the horse, he no longer planned to do so. It would indeed be easier to find the answer directly from the information obtained from the will of the world within the light of the heavens and earth, but that would obviously affect his understanding of cultivation. The reason behind this was very simple. The information obtained by the will of the world was extremely complicated, even exceeding the scope of Luo Fan's understanding. As a result, he could only fish through the ocean of information one net at a time. However, in the end, it had already refined the answer that he needed, and in the end, it could be considered as simplifying the problem that he originally encountered. This might make it easier for Luo Fan to improve in the short term, but in the long run, it would obviously affect his ability to find the answer in a situation where he had no clue at all. In other words, it would affect his comprehension of cultivation. If one were to use another analogy, the difference between the two was very easy to understand. Searching for the answer that one wanted from the information obtained by the will of the world was equivalent to doing a multiple-choice question with countless options. On the other hand, comprehending and searching for the answer by oneself was like building one's own model and thinking method, and then using the model and thinking method that one built and use the various information that one could find to obtain the answer. Doing a multiple-choice question with countless options was naturally not so easy to succeed, but after all, one had already raised a question and written down the answer. What one needed to do was to choose the answer that one thought was correct among the countless answers. This was obviously two completely different levels of difficulty compared to directly starting from a blank space, asking questions, coming up with formulas, creating an algorithm, and finally substituting the various conditions that one could find to answer the question, and finally obtaining the answer that one wanted. Perhaps, in a short period of time, the former method was indeed very convenient. It could indeed allow him to obtain the answer he wanted more easily, and it would also save him a lot of effort to obtain the answer he wanted. However, what if there came a day when there were no questions and no options? In other words, the question was wrong, and so were the choices. When that time came, how would one who had always used this convenient method to obtain the answer find the answer? As for whether Luo Fan would encounter such questions and options in the future, there was no need to ask at all. He would definitely encounter such a situation. One had to know that the thing that was giving him the question and the answer was the light of heaven and earth. However, Luo Fan's ultimate goal was to become a true sage, to achieve the level where the light of heaven and earth and the will of the world within it could be truly developed, and then reach the level of the perfect heaven and earth. As for his ultimate goal, what level did the light of heaven and earth have to grow to in order to solve it? At the very least, he had to let the light of heaven and earth grow to the level of the perfect heaven and earth, right? Even at this level, he might not have the ability to solve this problem. It was obvious that nurturing the will of the world within the light of heaven and earth to that level was not much easier than directly becoming a true sage. Don't look at other things. Luo Fan's current light of heaven and earth had devoured billions of trillions of the light of heaven and earth during his sixth Great Tribulation. But had his light of heaven and earth reached that level? It was obvious that his light of heaven and earth was still a long way from reaching the level where the heaven and earth's will would grow into a perfect heaven and earth's will. Currently, his light of heaven and earth had only reached a certain level of perfection at most. It was actually very easy to see this. If the will of the heavens and earth had reached that level, the light of the heavens and earth would at least be able to move freely in the state of chaos. It should also possess an essence that could not be worn down by thousands of tribulations. But Luo Fan's light of the heavens and earth obviously did not. Even the perfect world that was replicated after devouring an unknown number of trillions of quadrillions of tribulations was unable to advance the light of heaven and earth to that level. One could imagine how difficult it was. Even with Luo Fan's confidence, he did not think that he would encounter such a good opportunity again in the future. He did not think that the light of heaven and earth would obtain the same level of opportunity as devouring an unknown number of trillions of quadrillions of tribulations. Since that was the case, the chances of him cultivating the light of heaven and earth's will to the level of the perfect heaven and earth's will was obvious. And if he could not reach that level, the light of heaven and earth would naturally not be able to give him any questions or answers on how to become a true sage and how to take the final step. For this point, Luo Fan had never thought about it before. It was only when he realized that he had put the cart before the horse by focusing his cultivation on the light of heaven and earth. Only then did he understand all of this. When he thought about all of this, he sighed in his heart. He thought that his will was already firm and his mind was perfect. But in the end, his mind was still blinded by power. It was precisely because of this that he would completely bypass the light of heaven and earth and experience the various changes in his surroundings to find the secret of this place. For a long time, he had always obtained the answer from the light of heaven and earth. When he first started to comprehend it, he was at a loss and did not know where to start. This clearly meant that his comprehension ability had been weakened. This made him feel even more afraid. If this were to continue, wouldn't he become a useless person who had no abilities other than the light of heaven and earth in the end? Then what was the point of pursuing eternity and indestructibility? After realizing that he had indeed been affected by the light of heaven and earth, his focus shifted from the mystery of this strange place to another direction. He shifted his attention to how to pick up the ability to comprehend that he should have originally possessed. The secret of this place might be able to give him some benefits and some improvements, but compared to regaining his abilities, these benefits and improvements seemed insignificant. With this thought, he began to calm his mind and spread out his thoughts and senses. He sensed everything in his surroundings as if he had no destination, comprehending the countless changes in the light and shadows around him, as well as the various subtle mysteries contained in the changes in power. In the beginning, he was naturally at a loss. He tried to sense it, but he was like a headless fly. It seemed like everything was useful and could allow him to comprehend some profound mysteries that he had never comprehended before. It also seemed like everything was very familiar, and everything was just a combination of the many profound mysteries that he had previously grasped. However, with the flow of time, as his reliance on the will of the world gradually faded from his heart, the bewilderment gradually disappeared. The various strange and chaotic light figures gradually lost their chaotic momentum, and the various veins that were originally hidden within them became increasingly clear to his senses. More and more subtle comprehensions began to gradually flow into his senses and into his soul, causing his slightly dazed eyes to gradually focus. More and more dazzling light, and light began to flicker in the depths of his eyes. The feeling is finally back, as he sensed the various mysteries that could be comprehended from almost every abnormality, and the feeling of gaining something that could faintly touch his worldview returned. Luo Fan could not help but let out a long breath. His heart stirred slightly, and the question that he wanted to figure out previously appeared in his heart again. As this question surfaced in his mind, a way to find the answer instantly emerged in his mind. An inexplicable sense of confidence appeared in his eyes. Immediately after, his heart stirred slightly, and a thought was transmitted into the light of heaven and earth. As this thought was transmitted, the light of heaven and earth began to slowly converge, and the various corresponding changes that appeared on the light of heaven and earth began to gradually calm down. In the end, the light of heaven and earth completely turned into a brilliance that was as cool as water, forming the shape of a disk that hung behind his head. Only the slight squirming that seemed to be a living thing could tell that it was the light of heaven and earth, and not some kind of immortal light or divine light. During this process, the attacks that were derived from the boundless darkness that surrounded him also began to gradually converge. As the light of heaven and earth finally turned into the shape of a disk that hung behind his head, the endless attacks around him also converged to a rather calm state, only forming a faint crushing effect on Luo Fan's body, as well as on the disk that had turned into the light of heaven and earth. Just as I thought, the stronger the resistance, the stronger the attack. Luo Fan smiled and thought to himself. As he thought of this, the light of heaven and earth behind his head converged again, and in the end, only a faintly discernible, candle-like brilliance appeared behind his head, slowly expanding and contracting. With this change, the crushing force that originally still existed also converged to almost nothing. The faint crushing force just now was enough to make Luo Fan feel a great deal of pressure, so much so that he had to mobilize his strong will to support his body in order to defend himself. But now this crushing force no longer made him feel any pressure. He floated there, and the almost non-existent crushing force was only equivalent to tens of thousands of times Earth's gravity, and it was not even enough to make him feel pressure. How can I find its essence without directly touching it? Luo Fan raised his hand and grabbed at the air, and a mass of darkness fell into his hand. This darkness was extremely wonderful, and it was as smooth as silk in his hand. With a slight pinch, a huge rebounding force surged out from it and acted on his hand. With a slight thought, he directly poured his perception into the darkness in his hand. The moment his perception poured into it, he felt some kind of similar perception pouring into his body. As he examined the darkness, this perception also examined his body at the same time. Completely opposite feedback. This is indeed not an ordinary place. Sensing this abnormal perception, Luo Fan could not help but praise. He did not care about the internal situation of his body being sensed. This was because to him, the secret of his body was not worth mentioning at all. He did not need to worry at all that there would be some existence that would cause trouble for him, because it peeped at his body. After all, for the current Luo Fan, what was truly important had become the completely inseparable worldview of the laws. Everything else could be destroyed and created at will. Even his body in the real world at this moment was the same. Chapter 2446. Endless messy information surged into his mind through his senses, as if a vast world was unfolding before his eyes. In a trance, he seemed to be facing an existence that he was very familiar with, an existence that he had just made up his mind to cut off his dependence on. That's right, it was the light of heaven and earth, or To be more specific, it was the boundless will of the world that was contained within the light of heaven and earth. How is this possible? When he realized this, Luo Fan could not help but feel shocked. He felt that the world in front of him had become incomprehensible. After all, this was a boundless darkness. Its performance was worlds apart from the light of heaven and earth. It could even be said to be the complete opposite. However, the essence of such an existence was actually so similar to the light of the heavens and earth. How could he not be shocked? What's the secret? Very soon, Luo Fan calmed down and regained his composure. Although the situation in front of him was shocking, it was the truth in front of him. His shock did not make up for the truth. The most important thing now was to find out what was going on and know the truth. At this moment, Luo Fan's heart was filled with an indescribable, strong fighting spirit. This fighting spirit was born from a great challenge. It was a fighting spirit that would not stop until it reached its goal. He did not know how long it had been since this fighting spirit had appeared in his heart. At this moment, he suddenly felt an indescribable satisfaction when he recalled this fighting spirit again. It was as if he had finally started to move forward after stopping for a long time. Due to this change, he unknowingly wore a faint smile on his face. The appearance of this smile caused the atmosphere around him to suddenly turn from tense to relaxed. "That's exactly what I want. Let me uncover all of your secrets," he said faintly, and his perception seeped into the darkness one step further. An endless amount of messy information began to pour into his mind through his senses. Gradually, it gathered into a turbulent sea of information and began to surge endlessly in his mind. Most of this information was meaningless. Only a small portion of it could make Luo Fan feel an indescribable emotion when he sensed it. Furthermore, the deeper he went, the more such information appeared, and the more frequently it appeared. Due to this change, Luo Fan began to open up islands in the sea of information, gathering the information that he felt touched on those islands, making those islands grow bigger and bigger as time passed. At a certain moment, he sensed that some of the islands seemed to be connected to each other. He immediately connected these islands together, causing the number of islands to decrease, while the number of islands that remained to increase by several times. After an unknown amount of time, it felt like tens of millions of years, but it also felt like billions of trillion years. It also felt like only a few years had passed. At a certain moment, Luo Fan's heart trembled. He stopped the process of constantly sensing and receiving information and looked up at the darkness in front of him. In the darkness, there was a figure floating in the air. This figure exuded an indescribable aura. It was as if he was a supreme being that was indestructible and indestructible. At the same time, he seemed extremely peaceful, like an ordinary farmer walking on a rural road. He was more like a sage that contained infinite wisdom. The more one observed him, the more one could discover the wealth of information contained in him and the mysteriousness of his temperament. This temperament was something that Luo Fan was extremely familiar with. When he looked at the face again, it was even more familiar. It was none other than Luo Fan's own appearance. At this moment, the figure floated there and quietly looked at Luo Fan. That gaze made Luo Fan suddenly feel like he was looking at a mirror. Being stared at by that gaze felt like he was the one being stared at. Suddenly, he had a flash of inspiration, and he seemed to have understood something. He focused his attention on his mind, on the ocean of information that he had been constantly receiving from the darkness all these years. At this moment, the endless islands in the boundless sea of information had completely connected together. They had become a continent. It was an incomparably huge continent that occupied the center of the entire sea of information and was incomparably dilapidated. On the surface, there were pits everywhere. In some of the pits, one could see the ocean, but in others, it was completely empty. Those that could see the ocean were obviously damaged to the extreme, as if there was no land covering it at all. On the other hand, those that were empty were more complete. At the very least, there was already a portion of land there. Although it was much less than other places, at least there was a foundation. At a glance, those pits that could see the ocean looked like lakes on this continent. At this moment, the lakes on this continent were densely packed like stars. From this, it could be seen to what extent this continent was in ruins. As expected, it's already the first glimpse of completion. Looking at this scene, Luo Fan felt an indescribable emotion in his heart. When he saw the figure that was exactly like him appear in the darkness, he had already understood this in his heart. After all, the information he obtained from the darkness was received through his own perception from that massive darkness. When he sent his perception into the darkness also sent its perception into his body. Just like how he perceived the darkness, it also perceived his body and everything else. Under such circumstances, his perception of the darkness should be in sync with the perception that the darkness released to him. In other words, when his perception of the darkness reached a certain level, the darkness perception of him would also reach a certain level. In other words, when the darkness completely perceived him, it was equivalent to him perceiving this mass of darkness clearly. After understanding this, when he saw the figure that appeared in the darkness, he turned his attention to his mind. As long as all the information is sorted out, these gaps should be able to be filled. Looking at the broken continent, Luo Fan had another epiphany. Although the ocean of information was boundless and seemed to be much larger than the many depressions and gaps on the continent, that was only because the information in this ocean of information was messy and disorderly. If he sorted out the endless information and completely turned it into orderly information, its volume would definitely be extremely reduced. If it reached a certain limit, it would probably be similar to the volume of the hollow gaps on the continent at this moment. However, it was rather difficult to sort out the information. After all, the surrounding information was really too messy. He did not have a single clue at all, and he could not find any clues to sort out. Trying to sort out such information was as difficult as trying to smooth out a messy ball of thread. With a slight thought, he retracted his gaze and began to observe the continent from a macro perspective. This continent was in an extremely peculiar shape. It looked like a ship. This ship was in the shape of a sailboat. At a glance, it was lying flat. When he saw this ship clearly, a sense of transcendence flowed into his heart through his eyes, making him feel that this was definitely not an ordinary sailboat. Straightened out, with a slight thought, Luo Fan set off waves in his mind. This lying sailboat began to gradually tremble under the waves of his mind. This trembling became more and more intense with the changes of the waves. The trembling continued to increase, and after a while, the ship began to shake. Then, the entire ship began to change shape, gradually standing up from its original lying position. In the end, amidst the loud, rumbling sounds, the entire sailboat was completely upright. The sails pointed straight to the sky, and the bottom of the ship was close to the sea. The countless depressions on the continent looked like holes on the sailboat at this moment. The depressions that could be seen in the seawater were holes that ran through the hull of the sailboat. As for the depressions that couldn't be seen in the seawater, they were holes that didn't run through the hull of the sailboat. At this moment, the feeling of transcendence on the sailboat began to increase rapidly. The moment this feeling of transcendence became stronger, a strange attractive force appeared on the sailboat and began to act on the boundless sea of information around it. The information began to fly up and converge on the sailboat, converging on the many damaged parts of the sailboat. This kind of attractive force was really powerful. Under this kind of mental force, the surrounding sea of information began to swirl and gradually formed a vortex, constantly rotating and stirring up this sea of information. As the information gathered, the damaged parts of the sailboat began to be repaired. After an unknown period of time, the vortex caused by the sailboat absorbing information had already spread throughout the entire sea of information, making the entire sea of information a part of this vortex. This sailboat was already many times more complete than it was at the beginning. Although there were still many damages, it was no longer as if it would sink at any time. Previously, this sailboat made people suspect that it would completely disintegrate in the next instant. But now, although it was still damaged, at least people believed that it could sail on the sea. After an unknown period of time, all the information was absorbed by the sailboat. The ocean of information completely disappeared, and the whirlpool also completely disappeared. The sailboat had become flawless, and at a glance, there was no longer any damage to it. So that's how it is. It really is a ship. Looking at this scene, Luo Fan finally let out a long sigh of relief. With a thought, he raised his hand, and the information sailboat in his mind appeared in his hand. Information was an ethereal existence to normal living beings. It was an existence that could not be grasped or touched at all. But for truly powerful cultivators, it was real and could be controlled, manipulated, and touched at will. And obviously, Luo Fan was that kind of truly powerful cultivator. The moment this information sailboat appeared in his hand, the darkness around his body was instantly stirred up. In the blink of an eye, a void that was not filled with darkness was formed, and the outline of this void looked like a sailboat. This void existed here, and Luo Fan did not feel any pressure at all. It was as if he had suddenly returned to the normal space-time, or in other words, the normal fifth level of the Tao Master's Road. At this time, Luo Fan, who was condensed by the darkness, suddenly took action. He suddenly raised his hand and grabbed the information sailboat in Luo Fan's hand. Under this grab, endless heaven and earth light surged, and endless divine powers of concepts swam frantically. In a trance, there seemed to be billions of heaven and earth light slapping toward Luo Fan along with his palm. In the face of such a situation, Luo Fan's eyes narrowed, and he also slapped toward his opponent. Endless heaven and earth light and divine powers of concepts condensed in his palm, and along with this slap, it fiercely collided with his opponent's palm and the attacks that his opponent had condensed at this moment. Although he had cut off his dependence on the heaven and earth light, it did not mean that he would completely abolish the heaven and earth light and not use it at all. After all, the heaven and earth light was a kind of existence that he had condensed, and it also had incredible power. Since such an existence was in his body, it would obviously be overkill if he did not use it at all. Rumble, the heaven and earth light, and divine powers of concepts that Luo Fan's opponent slapped out instantly collapsed in this collision. Endless power swept all over his opponent's body, and in an instant his opponent was completely crushed, turning into nothingness in the blink of an eye. However, even so, Luo Fan did not relax at all. His eyes narrowed, and the existences that corresponded to him on many other planes simultaneously blasted toward the existence in front of him, completely annihilating the existence in those countless planes. Only at this moment did he relax a little. He was sure that he had finished off his opponent. After all, his opponent was condensed by the perception of his body from the darkness. Such an existence in itself contained almost all of his characteristics. Although facing the real him, due to the difference in cultivation process, the existence had no ability to resist him at all. However, its survival ability was not much different from his. In other words, if the existence corresponding to it was not erased from all planes, the other party would definitely not die. Chapter 2447. After erasing Luo Fan, who was derived from the darkness, from all levels, Luo Fan's expression only slightly relaxed. Although it was derived from the darkness and was an existence that was almost identical to him, it didn't bring him too much pressure. Defeating an existence that was identical to him was something that he couldn't be more familiar with. In fact, he had already concluded a fixed pattern, and after encountering it, he only needed to substitute himself for this pattern to easily achieve the result he wanted and obtain the final victory. The reason why his actions were so smooth just now was because he had grasped the weakness of this existence that was replicated. After erasing the existence that was identical to him in front of him, he finally had a foothold in this darkness. Looking around, there was a void that looked like a sailboat, and it was still endless darkness. This darkness was deep, unfathomable, and endless mysteries seemed to be hidden in it. This is the information contained in the darkness. Obviously, the essence of this darkness should be like this. After looking for a while, He turned his gaze to the sailboat in his hand, and this thought flashed in his mind. One must know that the origin of the sailboat was the product of all the information that he sensed from the mass of darkness in his hand. This clearly showed that the existence that originally seemed to have no resemblance to this piece of information at all was, in essence, completely or partially compatible with this piece of information. With this thought in mind, what he should do next was obviously needless to say. At this moment, with a thought in Luo Fan's heart, the sailboat-like information in his hand began to gradually enlarge. Not long after, it had become a 100 feet long sailboat, filling the sailboat-shaped void that was previously rejected. As this information filled this void, the originally empty void began to produce countless strange lights and shadows at this moment. There seemed to be endless runes, incantations, patterns, words, lines, and even endless sounds filling this void. This appearance made one feel as if a part of the world had suddenly been completely shattered and then merged back together, filling this small area. Immediately afterward, an indescribable suction force began to act on the endless darkness around him, continuously pulling the endless darkness towards this information sailboat. An unimaginable pressure began to appear at this moment, acting on Luo Fan, making him feel his body creak as if he was going to collapse under the terrifying pressure in the next moment. After discovering this feeling, Luo Fan didn't resist it. Instead, he followed this pressure and began to move towards the direction where the pressure is less. After a while, he had already moved to the deck of the sailboat. As he arrived, the astonishing pressure began to weaken rapidly. The rattling sounds coming from his body also became less and less frequent, and the sounds also became softer and softer. After absorbing a large amount of darkness, the endless information below seemed to be covered with a layer of strange luster, and its originally illusory nature seemed to have taken a small step towards reality. According to Luo Fan's senses, the weakening of the pressure on his body and the speed at which the sailboat's information became solid were completely synchronized. In other words, the more darkness the information absorbed, the smaller the pressure on his body became. This also confirmed Luo Fan's previous guess. He confirmed that he could really achieve his goal by doing this. In the process of information absorbing the darkness outside, Luo Fan was just at the beginning. The next change was entirely the interaction between this information and the endless darkness outside. Under this effect, the surrounding darkness gradually formed a huge whirlpool, drawing more and more darkness into the information of the sailboat, gradually filling up the outline of the information. This situation was similar to how the dilapidated sailboat-like island absorbed the boundless ocean of information around it in his mind. Similarly, many existences poured into the sailboat to fill the gaps, and similarly, a large volume poured into it and was quickly compressed into some insignificant details in the sailboat. If the volume of all the darkness that poured into the sailboat was added together, the volume would definitely be thousands of times larger than the sailboat. However, after the darkness that was thousands of times larger poured into the information sailboat, it only made the sailboat look a little more real. The material of the sailboat itself did not change much because of this, nor did it overflow because the volume of darkness that poured into the sailboat was larger than the information sailboat. The whole process was mysterious and inexplicable. On the deck, Luo Fan slowly closed his eyes, carefully feeling the pressure on his body and feeling the little changes in the information sailboat below. All kinds of subtle and indescribable truths and mysteries kept flowing through his heart, making him feel like he had comprehended something, but he couldn't tell what exactly he had comprehended. In this position where time didn't exist, the way Luo Fan measured time could only rely on his own feelings. However, in this state of wholeheartedly immersed in comprehension, his sense of time also became vague, as if it existed at the same time. Therefore, he didn't know how much time had passed. It seemed like hundreds of millions of years had passed, but it also seemed like only a few breaths. At a certain moment, Luo Fan suddenly felt his body lighten. The pressure on his body had completely disappeared, and an unprecedented sense of satisfaction and comfort surged in his heart. Is it done? His heart stirred slightly, and he looked down at the sailboat under his feet. At this time, the sailboat was no longer in its original appearance, but had become solid, completely built of some unknown material. At this moment, the sailboat was floating on a boundless black ocean. Above the black ocean was a boundless void. At a glance, there was no end to it, and he couldn't see anything substantial. The ocean below was incomparably distant and deep. Even if he exhausted his eyesight, he couldn't see through the black seawater to see what was at the bottom of the sea. No, it's not an ocean, it's a river. Suddenly, Luo Fan's heart stirred, and he overturned his previous understanding of the liquid below. The reason why he had this new understanding was because he found that the liquid below was flowing. It was flowing from one direction to another. It wasn't just the small area under his feet that was flowing like this. Whether it was the area that he could see or sense, they were all flowing in the same way and in the same direction, apart from a river. It couldn't be anything else with this characteristic. After all, given Luo Fan's perception range, it was simply unimaginable. If it was something like an ocean current, no matter how big the ocean was, there would definitely be some differences in the direction of his perception range. Because of this, he dared to confirm that this was a river and not an ocean. As for why it looked like an ocean, it was obviously because the river was really too big. Its width was so wide that even Luo Fan couldn't detect it with his perception. River, transcendence, sailboat. It seems like there are many secrets in the direction of this river's flow. With this thought in mind, Luo Fan released a concept god power from his body and turned into a gale that slammed into the sailboat's sail. The sailboat was extremely sturdy. Even though Luo Fan had unleashed his concept god power with all his might, it didn't cause any damage to the sail, nor did it cause any damage to the body of the sailboat. On the other hand, the sailboat began to accelerate down the river under the impact of this attack. Even though the concept god power couldn't compare to the light of heaven and earth, it was still an extremely incredible existence. Even though Luo Fan had only unleashed one attack, the concept god power had already begun to evolve according to the method that Luo Fan had set before he unleashed it. The concept god power attached itself to the sail and continuously released impact force, causing the sail to swell violently and produce an indescribable propulsion force that propelled the entire sailboat toward the downstream of the river. At this moment, Luo Fan's heart jolted slightly. He extended his hand forward and scooped out a mass of darkness that appeared in front of him. At first glance, this darkness seemed to be similar to the darkness before the sailboat was formed. However, as long as he observed it, he would find that although the appearance of these two kinds of darkness was similar, there was a world of difference in essence. Compared to the darkness before, this darkness seemed to be purer, and the pressure it emitted on Luo Fan also became several times stronger than the darkness before. It felt as if some impurities had been removed from the original impurities contained in the original impurities. Obviously, this sailboat was the impurities that had been removed from the darkness. With a thought, his perception penetrated into the mass of darkness in his hand. As his perception penetrated into it, some kind of perception came out of the darkness and penetrated his body. Obviously, the same feedback characteristics did not disappear because of the birth of this sailboat. The darkness in front of him would still be released because of his perception. Countless information continuously penetrated his body along with his perception and integrated into his mind, gradually accumulating into a sea of information in his mind. However, compared to before, in this sea of information, the information that Luo Fan could understand did not exist at all. Even though he spent several days searching bit by bit, he couldn't find a single piece of information that could give him that special feeling. It was as if this information had completely exceeded the limits of his understanding. Upon discovering this, Luo Fan frowned deeply. This situation was a little beyond his expectations. However, although he felt that it was troublesome, he did not stop receiving this information. Instead, he continued to send his perception into the darkness, continuously receiving the information transmitted to his mind by the darkness, and continuously filling it into the sea of information, making the sea of information rise and grow in size. After an unknown period of time, when another Luo fan appeared on the deck, he knew that this kind of perception had come to an end. The perception of this darkness had reached the point where it could completely construct him. Obviously, it meant that his perception had also reached the level where it could completely construct the information of the darkness. If he had a way to find the truth, so much information that he had received before would be enough for him to reach the final conclusion. If it was impossible for him to find the truth, then it would be meaningless to gather more information. With a thought, he turned his attention to the sea of information. After looking at it, he couldn't help but sigh. This sea of information was extremely uniform, and the endless information on it was calm. The entire sea looked extremely deep and mysterious. Let alone an island. It did not even have large fluctuations. This clearly only represented one fact, and that was, with his current level, it was impossible for him to understand the profoundness of the darkness before him. Seeing this, Luo Fan could only sigh. With a thought, the sea of information completely collapsed, and the endless information was instantly erased by him. So much information that he could not understand was simply a burden to his mind, and there were no secrets at all. Under such circumstances, it was naturally completely meaningless to leave this information behind. After completely erasing this information, he suddenly felt a sense of danger pouncing at him from the front. With a thought, he knew what was going on. Without even opening his eyes, he reached out with his hand, and a misty light appeared in his hand. This misty light was extremely strange, and it seemed to contain endless concepts. It was as if it was a living thing, and it seemed so mysterious and unbelievable. Poof! With a soft sound, the misty light hit something. Then, something suddenly shook, and everything from the inside to the outside completely collapsed in an instant. Even the marks and traces of its existence disappeared in the blink of an eye. At this moment, he opened his eyes and looked forward. He saw that the Luo Fan that was born from the darkness had collapsed once again. At this moment, his palm was also shining with all kinds of lights, and it was already in front of Luo Fan. It was about to hit Luo Fan's body. Obviously, it was the creature born from the darkness that wanted to attack Luo Fan, which made Luo Fan feel danger. Chapter 2448. In Luo Fan's mind, 100 years had passed unknowingly. In these 100 years, the ship kept accelerating under the effect of his concept god art. In the end, its speed had reached an unbelievable level, leaving an endless scratch on the pitch-black sea below. The feeling of riding the wind and breaking the waves was intense to the extreme. After such a voyage, the originally unchanging scenery in front of him gradually changed. An incomparably vast light screen lay in front of him, covering the sky and the sun. That means this ship is bringing people to the destination. Is it also the ultimate secret of this darkness? Looking at this scene, a look of anticipation appeared on Luo Fan's face. However, although he was looking forward to it, he didn't lose his composure. After all, he was quite clear that although the light screen looked incomparably vast, covering the sky and the sun, and seemed to be extremely close, it was just an illusion. In fact, the light screen was still extremely far away from his current position. Such a long distance wasn't worth him losing his composure at this time. Sure enough, things developed as he had expected. Even though he had seen the existence of the light screen long ago, it still took him nearly 100 years to truly arrive in front of the light screen. One had to know that in these nearly 100 years, this ship was constantly accelerating. Although the time seemed to be not much different from the previous 100 years, due to the difference in speed, the distance the ship traveled in these 100 years was several times longer than the previous 100 years. After arriving here, his line of sight was completely filled by this incomparably huge light screen. The endless dark liquid below emitted an indescribable beauty under the illumination of the light that was emitted from the light curtain. The originally incomparably terrifying darkness had unknowingly turned into an extremely attractive scenery. The light screen in front of him was incomparably wonderful, so wonderful that Luo Fan could only use his eyes to look at it. He couldn't use his other senses to sense it at all. His naked eye could clearly see the light screen, but his senses couldn't detect its existence at all. In his perception, the place where the light screen was located was empty, as if there was nothing there at all. With a slight thought, the concept god power that was constantly urging the sailboat to accelerate suddenly stopped. Immediately after, it changed direction and began to release its power to push the sail, creating a resistance that constantly slowed down the sailboat's speed. Although this light screen was his target, he was cautious and naturally would not directly charge into it without any understanding of it. However, he had to use some methods to study the nature of the light curtain and guess what he would encounter after entering the light curtain. Only then would he decide whether to rush into the light curtain or not. Even if he couldn't find any secrets from it and obtain the truth behind this light screen, he wouldn't miss out on this process. It was not difficult to slow down the ship. After all, when the ship accelerates, it will encounter the resistance of the seawater below. This resistance will constantly slow down the speed of the ship. If there was no propulsion, the ship would gradually stop as time passed. Now that there was the resistance of the concept god power, the speed of the ship's deceleration would naturally become more obvious. However, even so, after accelerating for 200 years, such a small distance was not enough for the ship to completely stop when it reached the light curtain. Therefore, Luo Fan's heart moved slightly during this process. He directly twisted the sails of the ship and began to change the direction of the ship from rushing straight toward the light curtain to moving in a certain direction along the light curtain. His plan went quite smoothly. In the end, before the ship was about to hit the light curtain, its direction was finally completely reversed to a direction parallel to the light curtain. It began to stick to the light curtain and began to move quickly towards the left side of Luo Fan. Looking at its forward motion, it was also braving the wind and waves. Then it took another few years for the ship to really stop. However, even so, Luo Fan was still unwilling to stop using the concept god power on the sail. Instead, he still used the concept god power to form an obstacle for the sail. After all, the water of this river could flow. If there was no resistance on the sail, the ship would not be able to stay in one place at all. Instead, it would definitely be gradually brought into the light curtain by the water current. In that case, the fruits of his previous years of hard work would naturally be in vain. The ship stopped against the huge light curtain. With a slight thought, Luo Fan came to the edge of the ship and raised his hand toward the light curtain. To him, the light curtain in front of him was already extremely attractive. In particular, after holding back from touching the light curtain for several years, he could no longer suppress the urge to touch the light curtain. The moment his palm came into contact with the light curtain, he suddenly felt a strange warmth coming from his hand. That warmth was extremely bizarre. Even if he had already made preparations and set up all his defenses, that warmth still directly entered his heart, causing all his defenses to turn into floating clouds. It was completely useless. Evidently, the warmth was not just a sense of touch, but an extremely deep concept. The moment he came into contact with the light curtain, it directly eroded Luo Fan's soul and made him feel warm. The erosion was so absolute and powerful that it felt like a world was pressing down on him. He wanted to resist, but he did not know where to exert his strength. Fortunately, the erosion was just a warm feeling and did not contain anything else. It did not trigger his sense of danger, nor did it affect his consciousness. How wonderful! I can't sense it, but it can erode my senses. Sensing the change, this thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. At first glance, the light curtain in front of him seemed to be extremely pure light. There did not seem to be any more details or complicated structures inside. However, it was obvious that with such strange characteristics, how could it only be pure light? Sensing the harmless erosion of the light curtain on his soul, Luo Fan's heart moved. He gradually extended his arm into the light curtain, wanting to break through it to sense the various things behind it. Squeak, squeak, squeak. In an instant, a strange sound came from his hand. Along with this light sound, his palm was instantly torn apart by an indescribable power. His senses toward his palm had completely disappeared at this moment. Chaos. This term appeared in Luo Fan's mind at this moment. With a thought, he retracted his arm, only to find that it was empty from his elbow down. The forearm and palm that originally existed there had disappeared without a trace. The fracture was extremely strange. It wasn't smooth, but it wasn't very uneven either. It felt like it had been corroded by some kind of existence. Moreover, there was no blood flowing out from the fracture. It was as if the fracture had been completely sealed by some extremely strange mechanism. Sure enough, it's the state of chaos. Behind this light curtain is the state of chaos. Looking at this scene, Luo Fan's eyes narrowed. From the fracture of this arm, he could clearly feel the traces of the state of chaos left behind. Although these traces were not clear, an ordinary cultivator would probably completely ignore them. But for Luo Fan, with his familiarity with the state of chaos, he could clearly feel the charm of the state of chaos. Even through the analysis of the wound, he could roughly analyze how the state of chaos eroded, assimilated, and completely engulfed his forearm and palm. How could this be? It shouldn't be. Looking at this scene, Luo Fan could not help but feel inexplicably confused. After all, even in the Tao Master's path, it was not difficult for an existence like Luo Fan to enter the state of chaos. He only needed to use some means to break a certain layer of the void of the Tao Master's path until it could not be broken anymore. Then, he would naturally be able to connect to the state of chaos. At that time, if he wanted to enter it or do any experiments, it would be easy. In this case, why would there be a need for such a long river to connect to the state of chaos? Could it be that I'm wrong? This is not the goal, but the beginning? At this time, this idea emerged in Luo Fan's mind again. He guessed that this direction was the goal of the river, and the reason was none other than the direction in which the river flowed. After all, the river flowed toward the light curtain from another direction, and the water in the river had the transcendent nature of the sailboat. Obviously, the purpose of the existence of the river was to bring some existence to the light curtain, or in other words, to the existence behind the light curtain. However, if the state behind the light curtain was the state of chaos, then the situation was obviously not right. If he wanted to enter the state of chaos, why would he need this river? Why couldn't he do it? After thinking for a while, Luo Fan exhaled a long breath. The light of heaven and earth that was originally faintly discernible behind his head began to gradually condense, turning into a clear disk that was as clear as water. It slightly squirmed behind his head, as if it was a living creature that was thinking about something. Then a root extended from the light of heaven and earth, piercing into the light curtain in the blink of an eye. As the root entered the light curtain, it shook slightly, and there seemed to be a circle of ripples that began to spread in all directions from the place where it was inserted. However, at this time, Luo Fan obviously did not pay attention to these ripples. At this time, he was already shocked by the projection of the disc and the various things that the root came into contact with. At this time, the roots had already entered a world of light, a world that was covered by endless light, a world that only had light. Through the perspective of the root, he could see that there seemed to be an incomparably vast world inside the light curtain. The root had extended for an unknown number of trillions of light years, but still could not reach the end of the light curtain, nor could it touch the existence behind the light curtain. Compared to when he put his arm into the light curtain previously, there was a fundamental difference. One must know that when his arm reached into the light curtain previously, it only extended a few inches, and it had already touched the existence behind it, which was very likely to be in the state of chaos. I don't believe it. With a thought, Luo Fan continued to urge the light of heaven and earth, allowing the root that extended from the light of heaven and earth to continue extending into the depths of the world of light. It would not stop until it reached the end. In this way, in the blink of an eye, in Luo Fan's perception, 10 years had passed. In 10 years, with the speed at which the root extended, even a vast world of trillions of light years should have been penetrated dozens of times. However, at this time, the root was still in the endless light and could not penetrate the world of light at all. It could not come into contact with the existence behind the light curtain that he suspected to be in the state of chaos. The scene that appeared in the disc also told him that the extension of the root was not just an illusion. The root had indeed extended for 10 years, and the distance that it had extended had reached an unknown number of trillions of light years. It could be said that at this moment, at a glance, one could only see the endless root appearing in the disc, which looked like a line that traversed the world of light. Seems like this method won't work. Looking at this scene, Luo Fan could only sigh and stop this futile action. Although he had the determination to not give up until he reached the end, since he had not made any progress in the past 10 years, it clearly proved that there was some kind of mechanism that prevented him from succeeding. Continuing was obviously just a waste of time. With a thought in his mind, the light of heaven and earth withdrew slightly, and the roots that were countless trillions of light years long were withdrawn in a flash, returning to the light of heaven and earth with ease. The entire process was tens of thousands of times easier than the previous difficult and torturous process. Through the changes in light and shadow that were reflected on the light of heaven and earth during the process of the root retracting, Luo Fan was even more certain that the root had indeed extended for trillions of light years. After retracting the root, Luo Fan sighed and stepped out of the sailboat. The moment he stepped out of the sailboat, a powerful crushing force was generated from all directions and directly pressed on his body. Chapter 2449. This kind of pain was nothing to Luo Fan, who had stayed in the same place for so long. With just a thought, his body trembled slightly, and the various powers in his body circulated slightly, restoring his body to normal. The terrifying crushing force bypassed his body and was directly sent to his back, no longer having any effect on him. Not long after, as he adjusted his body, even the force that bypassed his body disappeared without a trace. His body that was hovering in the void now looked like it was in a normal void. After doing this, his heart stirred slightly, and the sailboat slowly sailed towards the light curtain with the roots of the light of heaven and earth that had just been retracted. He intended to use the transcendence characteristic of this sailboat to test the light curtain. As the sailboat sailed into the light curtain, ripples were constantly released in all directions. An indescribable resistance acted on the sailboat, causing it to need an extremely strong force to move forward. And because of this, Luo Fan needed the divine ability that he had used on the sail of the sailboat to constantly surge its power, pushing the sailboat to overcome the resistance and constantly strive to move forward at this time. The roots of the heaven and earth light also entered the light curtain unknowingly. The heaven and earth light also revealed the scene inside the light curtain. The moment he saw the scene, Luo Fan's eyes narrowed. However, he suddenly saw that the scene in the light screen was not what the roots saw when it entered alone. It was a boundless, completely covered world of light. Instead, it was a thin layer of light that was as clear as water. Soon, this layer of light was broken by the sailboat's momentum. A strange vibration came from behind the light, and the entire ship seemed to have suffered a shocking blow. Starting from the bow, it kept shaking. This vibration contained a strong sense of destruction. Even if he wasn't on the ship, with the roots of the heaven and earth light, Luo Fan could clearly feel the incredible and terrifying impact on the ship at this moment. Under that impact, even the roots of the heaven and earth light couldn't bear it, and showed signs of collapsing. How could this be? Looking at this scene, Luo Fan couldn't help but be shocked. It had to be known that this sailboat was formed by combining the various information contained in the pitch-black river with the power of the river. The transcendence characteristic was extremely obvious, and it was clearly in existence that could help him transcend some kind of shackles. However, at this time, the place that this ship brought him to was actually so dangerous. He didn't even come into direct contact with it, but just a slight touch from the ship was enough to bring him such danger. How could he not be shocked? Fortunately, he wasn't on the sailboat, but outside. Therefore, the various changes on the sailboat in the end only caused the scene projected by the heaven and earth light to shake, but it didn't cause him any harm. In this way, the entire sailboat quickly passed through the light screen, bringing with it the roots of the heaven and earth light. After arriving behind the light screen, the roots allowed Luo Fan to finally see the scene behind the light screen. Behind the light screen was a strange place with specks of light mixed in with the grayish haze. This kind of gray existence exuded an extremely strong, chaotic aura, and the specks of light contained all kinds of wonderful auras. When the two of them interweaved, they formed an extremely strange and hazy gray starry sky. The endless gray existence in this starry sky seemed to reject everything that stepped into it. When the sailboat entered, all kinds of terrifying power were produced from all directions and released towards the ship, continuously crushing it. This kind of power was extremely mysterious. In the process of this impact, it directly peeled off the surface defense of the ship and continuously impacted the hull of the ship. This kind of impact caused the ship to shake continuously. At the same time, all kinds of indescribable brilliance were released, constantly resisting the power released by the surrounding gray existence, trying their best to protect the ship. Through the heaven and earth light, Luo Fan could see that the gray existence contained endless information, infinite principles, and endless cultivation mysteries. Time, space, matter, and energy were mixed together in a way that he couldn't understand at all. Together with the countless specks of light, they formed this gray starry sky. Chaotic state. Luo Fan came to a realization as he looked at the grayish existence. He didn't know what the light was, but he was quite clear that the gray existence had the characteristics of the state of chaos. With a thought, he raised his hand and looked at his arm that had been destroyed once. At this time, his arm had completely recovered at some point, but there were still some remnants of the aura of the state of chaos left on it. It was this aura that made this arm look different from the other parts of his body. This difference was not because it was powerful or weak, but because it felt different. I'm actually still alive? With a thought, Luo Fan focused his gaze on a certain speck of light in the gray starry sky. On that speck of light, he could sense the aura of the owner of the light that had turned into an abyss. It was obvious that the mark of that creature was on that speck of light. In fact, that creature's current state was probably much better than what Luo Fan had imagined. After all, although that speck of light was very close to the sailboat, there was still that gray existence with the characteristics of the state of chaos between that speck of light and Luo Fan. Under such circumstances, the aura of the mark could still be transmitted over and sensed by the roots of the light of heaven and earth on the sailboat. This was enough to show that the mark was definitely far more powerful than he had imagined. Only in this way could its aura cross the gray existence and be sensed by him. Since he was already here, Luo Fan naturally wouldn't give up on the hope of checking the situation of the mark. With a thought, he urged the sailboat to move toward that speck of light. Fortunately, the speck of light was very close to where they were. Thus, the roots of the light of the heavens and earth did not need to extend too far. It only extended for a few dozen feet before the ship arrived in front of the speck of light and directly faced it. But even so, there was still a portion of the roots that came into contact with the gray starry sky. During this process, the gray starry sky underwent a subtle change. All kinds of pressure and destruction began to appear from all directions, pouring toward the spot that came into contact with the gray starry sky. It directly caused the roots to tremble and sway continuously. If it weren't for the fact that the gray existence in the surroundings seemed to possess many characteristics of the state of chaos, it ultimately wasn't the true state of chaos, and its quality was much worse than the state of chaos. Perhaps the impact and pressure alone would have completely severed the roots. But even so, it was already a little strenuous for Luo Fan. When he looked at the light, he saw that there was a space within it. It was an extremely strange space filled with countless strange lights and shadows. The laws of this space were extremely imperfect, so much so that it couldn't even maintain the balance of a complete world. Everything was in a state of ever-changing changes at every moment. Inside, Luo Fan could see everything in the world. He could see everything in the world, but all of it was presented in an extremely chaotic manner. It felt like the scene of the world when he controlled the light of heaven and earth to devour the great Tao during the Great Calamity. There were images of countless living beings within it. Among the countless living beings, there were ordinary beings, creatures without intelligence, and even cultivators with shocking intelligence. Their identities seemed to be changing at every moment. At one moment, a living being was a loach wriggling in a quagmire, but in the next moment, it could turn into a supreme expert standing at the peak of cultivation. In the next moment, it could turn into a maggot. With such endless changes, even if Luo Fan used the roots of the light of heaven and earth to observe everything, he still couldn't determine how many living beings existed within the light. He couldn't understand the changing patterns of the many living beings within. However, even so, he had already found what he wanted to find. At this moment, he had already locked onto the mark of the cultivator who had drawn him here. The cultivator's mark had already turned into a living being, and it was also undergoing all sorts of unimaginable chaotic changes in the chaotic space within the light. It was also sometimes strong and sometimes weak. However, what was different from the other living beings was that the core of this living being was constantly releasing resplendent light. It was this resplendent light that completely distinguished it from the other living beings around it. This resplendent light seemed to be extremely important to the entire space. It seemed to be some kind of driving force within the light space, and it seemed like it was precisely because of this resplendent light that the light space could constantly transform and change. In the end, the entire space was constantly changing, causing the countless living beings within it to constantly change. With a thought, Luo Fan slowly moved the roots of the light of heaven and earth towards the light and slowly seeped into it. The light of heaven and earth was also light, and even the roots of the light of heaven and earth were actually formed from light. Under such circumstances, when the roots penetrated into the light space, it was as if they were existences of the same nature as the light and had fused into the light space. As long as the roots didn't release the incredible power that they contained, the light space wouldn't change because of this. Thus, the roots easily seeped into the light space without causing any fluctuations. They directly arrived around the living being that was formed from the mark, which was constantly changing its identity, and immediately wrapped around that living being. At this moment, a massive and unparalleled distorting force directly acted on the roots of the light of heaven and earth. With a loud cracking sound, the entire space of light exploded in an instant. The terrifying impact directly stirred up the surrounding grayish existence and created trillions of inconceivable existences. Very quickly, they were completely devoured by the grayish existence outside and disappeared without a trace. At this moment, the living being that was grabbed by the roots of the light of heaven and earth had a blank expression on its face, as if it didn't know what to do. Then, the living being suddenly exploded, leaving only a trace of the living being's mark where it had originally been. At this moment, the living being came to its senses. The mark slightly distorted, and then a body emerged. It was the body of a young man. He looked quite handsome, and his whole body was surrounded by a sense of holiness and nobility. However, because the mark had just been condensed, this living being's body now looked quite fragile. At most, it had reached the level of an expert in the tribulation realm. A body at this level was naturally much stronger than that of an ordinary practitioner, but compared to a practitioner above the 5th level of the Road of Tao Master, it was as fragile as tofu. The man was obviously not satisfied with this body, for he frowned after it was condensed. However, after all, He knew the severity of the situation and understood that this was not the time to refine his body. Immediately, he bowed in the direction of the ship and said, "Thank you for saving me, Taoism peer. Without you, I don't know how long I would have to sink in this illusory space." Luo Fan's heart stirred slightly. The roots of the light of heaven and earth pulled the man's body slightly back to the capsized ship and directly placed the man on the deck. Then, the roots of the light of heaven and earth slightly condensed and turned into the figure of Luo Fan, standing in front of the man. Of course, the Luo Fan transformed by the roots of the light of heaven and earth could not be a doppelganger or a projection of Luo Fan. It was just a kind of image of the roots. At most, its meaning was to let the person who talked to it feel like he was talking to someone else, rather than talking to a ball of light. "It's just because your light of heaven and earth begged me to act, and it has little to do with you." Luo Fan just said so. Through the influence of his perception, the Luo Fan condensed by the roots opened its mouth at the same time and said the same thing.